Hello there, and welcome to Planet in Question, the little corner of calm where curiosity finds room to breathe, and science slows its pace to a gentle drift. Tonight we will be wandering into one of the largest what-ifs the Earth has ever offered us. It is a thought so vast that it stretches across the entire planet, and yet so quiet that it can fold you into a dream without asking for effort. It begins with something you may remember from a schoolbook or a poster on a classroom wall. The supercontinent called Pangea. Most of us first encountered Pangea as a neat puzzle. The teacher slid a map across the desk, then shifted the continents back together until the jagged edges of South America rested against the smooth curve of Africa. North America tilted in toward Europe. India pressed against Asia like a traveller finding its way back home, and there it was, a single massive landmass, stretching nearly from one pole to the other, wrapped by a single endless ocean. To see those edges locked together felt satisfying, almost inevitable, as though the continents had only been separated yesterday, and we were restoring them to their rightful place. But the truth is that Pangea was not yesterday. It existed about 300 million years ago, long before humans, long before mammals, even long before flowering plants. Back then, reptiles were beginning to stretch their limbs on land, giant insects hummed through strange forests, and the world was preparing for the long reign of the dinosaurs. Over millions of years, Pangea itself would fragment, pushed and pulled apart by the slow churn of plate tectonics, until the continents drifted into the arrangement we know today. That is the history. But tonight, history is not what we are asking. Tonight, we are asking, what if the break never happened? What if Pangea had remained one colossal continent, never splintered, never scattered into pieces drifting across a blue planet? What kind of world would we live in now? Before we step into that vast thought, I'd like to pause and invite you into something small. Where are you listening from right now? Maybe it's nighttime, and you're curled beneath a blanket with the soft glow of a screen beside you. Maybe the afternoon sun is shining through your window, and you've chosen this calm journey as a moment of rest between the busy tasks of the day. Or perhaps you're travelling, headphones on, watching the real landscape slip past while imagining the landscapes that might have been. However you've arrived here, you and I are sharing this same gentle question, a question that spans the Earth itself. There's something fitting in that, don't you think? All of us, scattered across different continents, imagining a world where continents were never scattered at all. Let's linger on that image of unity for a while. A single continent means a single continuous expanse of land. Imagine standing on a shoreline, the waves reaching for your feet, the salt air brushing your skin. Now imagine beginning to walk inland. You cross plains, you pass through forests, you climb mountains, you descend into valleys, you follow rivers to their sources, you move across deserts, and you keep going. Days turn to weeks, weeks to months, and still there is land, always land, stretching without interruption, a single skin of stone and soil that never yields to ocean. That is what Pangea was. A world where you could, in theory, walk across the entire surface of Earth without ever needing to build a boat. There's a strange comfort in that thought. Oceans are beautiful, yes, but they are also barriers. They separate us, keep us apart, make us invent ships and compasses and maps to connect with one another. On a Pangea Earth, those barriers wouldn't exist. Every creature that walked the land could, given enough time, reach every other. Every plant could spread, every storm could sweep unbroken across 1,000 miles of soil. The planet would feel less like a patchwork of separate worlds and more like a single giant stage. But what would that stage look like now, if the curtain of history had never shifted? When I picture it, I find myself imagining climate first. Today, our continents break up the oceans, channeling them into currents that swirl heat around the globe. Warm waters rise along coasts, cold waters sink in polar regions, and the constant turning keeps the planet's temperatures in a delicate balance. But on an Earth of one continent, all that balance would change. There would be a vast interior, so far from the sea that rain would rarely reach it, a desert so enormous it would dwarf our present-day Sahara. Along the coasts, storms might gather with unusual intensity, crashing against unbroken shorelines. The poles might grow colder, the equator hotter, and in between, strange belts of forest and grassland might stretch for thousands of miles. It would be a planet of extremes, and yet also a planet of continuity, where ecosystems flowed into one another without the breaks and barriers of today. Now, consider life. When Pangea began to break apart in our own timeline, animals and plants rode those fragments of land into isolation. That isolation became a kind of laboratory shaping unique creatures. That is why marsupials flourish in Australia, why lemurs thrive in Madagascar, why South America once hosted giant sloths and terror birds, unlike anything found elsewhere. Separation created diversity. Without it, life would have been far more uniform. Imagine fewer unique ecosystems, but vaster herds. Fewer isolated marvels, but more universal species marching across the same landmass. Dinosaurs might have spread more evenly, and later, mammals too. Perhaps humanity itself would have emerged not in a single region, but across wide, connected landscapes. Our differences might be fewer, our commonalities greater. Or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps with no seas to slow us, conflict and competition would have swept across Pangea too quickly, pressing us into different forms of survival. And then, of course, there is civilization. Oceans have always been our walls and our windows. They kept us apart, but they also carried our ships, our ideas, our stories across to one another. Without oceans dividing us, what would have happened? Would there have been a single cradle of civilization stretching outward like ripples in a pond until it covered the supercontinent? Would languages still have splintered into thousands of voices, or would they have remained fewer, spoken across vast regions? Would we have invented navies, sails, and compasses, or would our technology have grown differently, shaped by rivers and mountains instead of seas? These are the kinds of questions that draw us closer tonight. They are not puzzles with right answers. They are doorways to imagination, ways of seeing not only what might have been, but also what truly is. Because thinking about a world where Pangea never broke apart helps us notice the strange gift of the world we actually have. The variety born of separation, the connections made across distance, the uniqueness of each continent and each culture. To wonder about the road not taken is to see more clearly the path we walk now. So, as we begin this long and gentle journey together, let's not hurry. Let's stroll, the way you might stroll along a shoreline, noticing the patterns of waves, the driftwood, the shells, each detail small but steady. Over the next chapters, we will wander through the forests, deserts, and cities of this imagined world, following what might have been if Pangea had never let go of itself. And all the while, we will carry a quiet awareness. The earth beneath us is not fixed. It is restless, alive, always moving. The world we know is just one face of a planet that has worn many masks and could have worn others still. For now, let the question linger softly. What if Pangea never broke apart? Chapter 1. A single giant land. Picture yourself at the edge of a shoreline, standing where water laps against stone. Behind you, an unbroken expanse of land stretches farther than the eye can measure. Before you lies a single ocean, vast and unending, circling the globe like a deep blue crown. Now imagine turning away from that ocean and beginning to walk inland. You travel across meadows of grass, then into forests where the trees tower like ancient guardians. You cross deserts, their dunes glowing beneath the sunday. You climb mountains that rise from the earth like colossal sculptures, and still you walk, day after day, month after month, and you never encounter another ocean, never reach a limit where the land falls away into the sea. Instead, the continent carries you endlessly onward. This is the feeling of Pangea. One giant land, continuous, immense, a single face of Earth that would never have broken apart. It is difficult to truly grasp the scale of this thought. Today, the largest continuous landmass we know is Eurasia, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean all the way across to the Pacific. It is already vast enough to contain deserts, forests, tundra, jungles, and mountain ranges beyond counting. Yet even Eurasia is only a fragment compared to the scale of Pangea. Pangea gathered almost all the world's continents into one, stretching from the northern polar regions into the deep southern hemisphere, its width and length unimaginable when compared to any modern map. To live on such a continent would have been to live in a place where horizons carried no promise of a distant shore, where land itself was the overwhelming truth of the planet. When we think of land, we usually think of edges, coasts where land gives way to sea, borders where one country meets another, boundaries drawn by rivers, forests, or deserts. But in a world of unbroken land, those edges would be fewer, and the heart of the continent would be unlike anything we know. Far from the moderating influence of the ocean, the interior would be harsh. Summers would burn with heat that could turn plains into deserts, while winters might plunge into bitter cold. Imagine a desert, not the size of a country, not the size of the Sahara even, but larger than all the deserts of today combined, stretching thousands of miles, a sea of sand and stone broken only by rare rivers. Such an interior would have been difficult to cross, perhaps nearly impossible for early animals, and even later for people. The outer edges of Pangea, closer to the ocean's moisture, would have been fertile and lush, but its centre would be a place of extremes. Walking across this land in your imagination, you might notice something strange: the patterns of animals. In our real world, different continents produce different families of creatures. South America once hosted enormous ground sloths and terror birds. Australia gave rise to marsupials like kangaroos and koalas. Africa carried elephants, giraffes, and lions. These differences happened because oceans separated them, giving evolution space to experiment in isolation. But in a Pangea that never broke apart, the land would have kept all those creatures together. Predators and prey would have spread across the whole continent, filling niches that were not duplicated on separate islands of land. Instead of unique pockets of life, there would have been a grand, continuous stage where herds roamed freely from one end to the other, where forests might carry the same birdsong for thousands of miles, where the same predators stalked plains from north to south. The diversity would be less scattered, more universal, shaped by climate and terrain rather than isolation. If humanity had emerged in such a place, our story would feel profoundly different. Imagine our ancestors roaming across wide belts of land, meeting others not separated by oceans but only by distance. Migration would have been easier in some ways, harder in others. It would not have required ships or the courage to cross dangerous waters, but it would have demanded endurance to cross deserts, patience to navigate endless mountain ranges, and ingenuity to survive long stretches without food or water. Communities might have formed farther apart than they did in our real world, separated not by seas but by the sheer effort of walking through the vast interior. Meeting another group of humans would still carry wonder, but the paths to one another would be carved across land rather than water. And what about culture? In our fragmented world, languages sprouted like seeds in separate fields, each continent carrying its own clusters of tongues. On Pangea, it is possible fewer languages would have emerged, or perhaps they would have spread farther before branching apart. Trade routes might have stretched in astonishing lines across thousands of miles, carrying not only goods but also stories, songs, and myths. A single legend could ripple outward, retold and reshaped across immense distances, until it touched nearly every community on the continent. What might such a myth have been? Perhaps one about the ocean, that great encircling water which lay forever at the edge of the land but never within it. To people born on Pangea, the ocean might have seemed less like a neighbour and more like a boundary, too immense to cross, a mysterious border that kept the world whole. The rivers of Pangea would have been its lifelines. Without oceans to separate cultures, rivers and mountain ranges would have taken on even greater importance. Imagine rivers longer than any we know, winding for thousands of miles across plains, carving valleys that became natural highways for migration and trade. Great civilizations might have risen not along short stretches of fertile coast but deep inland, anchored to rivers that threaded through otherwise barren landscapes. A single river could have tied together cultures separated by deserts, carrying boats loaded with food, tools, and stories to distant neighbours. Mountains too would have been formidable. Instead of dividing continents, they would have divided entire halves of the supercontinent, becoming barriers as daunting as oceans are today. The Himalayas, already vast, would seem only a piece of the great chains that stitched Pangea together. It is a humbling exercise to imagine what daily life might feel like on such a land. For those living close to the coasts, the sea would still be familiar, but it would not be something to cross toward new worlds. It would simply be the edge of the only world that existed. For those living inland, the sea might never even be seen. Generations could pass in forests, grasslands, or deserts without a single person reaching the coastline. The ocean would become not a shared experience but a rumour, a tale told by travellers who had walked farther than most dared to go. Entire societies might live and die in the heart of Pangea, never knowing that water stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. Standing on that land in your imagination, you might notice how scale itself becomes different. Today, when we look at a globe, we see continents separated by blue. That blue gives shape to the brown and green. Without it, the brown and green would dominate, filling the globe almost entirely. The sheer presence of land would make Earth feel heavier, more solid, as though the planet itself were anchored by stone rather than carried by waves. The word continent would not even exist, for there would be no contrast. There would be only the land and the sea, one of each, vast and undeniable. The strangeness of this thought is that it makes our own world feel fragile by comparison. We live on fragments, broken pieces drifting apart, and those fragments have given us the diversity we treasure, the different animals, the different languages, the different histories. If Pangea had never broken, much of that difference would not exist. Instead, we would share one great land, one endless surface. Perhaps our conflicts would be larger, our migrations longer, our myths fewer but stronger. Perhaps our civilizations would rise and fall like waves across the supercontinent, each one echoing the last, spreading far and wide before fading into dust. As you hold that picture in your mind, the endless plains, the colossal rivers, the deserts stretching without end, let it settle quietly. The thought of one giant land is not only a scientific what if, it is also a kind of meditation. It reminds us that the earth has worn many faces, and that the world we know now could have been entirely different. Tonight, in the stillness, you and I are walking across a land that never ends, a land where the continents never broke apart, where every step is another step into Pangea. Chapter 2. The Endless Ocean. If Pangea was the single vast land of Earth, then it was embraced by a single endless ocean. Imagine for a moment that the world's seas are not divided into the familiar names we use today: Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, Arctic, but instead gathered into one colossal body of water. A blue ring wrapped entirely around the planet, deep and continuous, without boundaries. This was called Panthalassa, the All-Sea, and if Pangea had never broken apart, then Panthalassa would still be here, rolling against the edges of one giant continent circling endlessly. To picture this is to see Earth in a way that feels both familiar and alien, a planet dominated not by scattered continents, but by a single ocean with no interruptions. Stand on the shoreline of such a world. The waves stretch before you, not toward another land, not toward an island, not toward a distant continent, but toward nothing but more water, horizon after horizon. The ocean becomes less like a passage, and more like an infinity, an expanse too large to truly fathom. Today, when we look at a globe, the Pacific Ocean already feels unimaginably wide, thousands of miles from coast to coast. Yet Panthalassa would have been even more immense, encircling the entire Earth, its width larger than any ocean today. Imagine storms rising on its surface, building strength without interruption, circling the globe with winds and waves of extraordinary power. A hurricane today can devastate coastlines, but in Panthalassa, storms might have grown larger still, fed by waters with no land to break their spin. The presence of a single ocean would have changed the rhythms of climate in ways we can only speculate about. Today, ocean currents carry heat around the globe, warming and cooling continents, balancing extremes. Warm currents like the Gulf Stream travel northward, moderating climates, while cold currents slip down from polar regions, shaping ecosystems along the way. These currents depend on the arrangement of continents, the breaking of oceans into different basins. But with one endless sea, the currents would have been freer, larger, sweeping around the world in loops of unimaginable scale. Perhaps heat would have carried farther toward the poles. Perhaps the equator would have remained a belt of relentless warmth. Perhaps ice would have spread more deeply at the edges of the world. The balance we know would never have existed, and life would have been shaped by this different rhythm. To imagine Panthalassa is also to imagine how it might have looked and felt to people who lived near it, if humanity had grown up along its coasts. In our world, oceans invited us outward. They challenged us to build rafts, then boats, then ships with sails. They carried explorers and traders to new lands, separated but reachable. On a Pangea Earth, the ocean would not invite in the same way. It would be too vast, too uniform, too endless to cross with the simple tools of early seafaring. For most of human history, it might have remained an unreachable mystery, a presence on the horizon that never gave anything back. People might have told stories of what lay across it, but those stories would stretch farther than imagination could reasonably fill. Perhaps they would say that the ocean led not to new lands but to the edge of the world, a border beyond which nothing existed. Without smaller seas to practice upon, our ancestors might have learned to fear the water more than they trusted it. And yet, the ocean has always been generous. It feeds the coasts with fish, it offers salt and shells, it provides tides that mark the passage of time. Panthalassa would have done the same, only on a scale that dwarfs the familiar. Imagine coastal communities strung along thousands of miles of shoreline, never separated by seas but all sharing the same ocean. Their myths and songs might have carried similar themes, shaped by the same tides and storms. Their economies might have depended on the bounty of the shore, yet their lives would also have been shaped by the fear of venturing too far outward. Boats would exist, yes, but perhaps more for hugging the coastline, never for venturing into the impossible infinity. The dream of another land beyond the water might not even have been born, because there would be no reason to suspect such a land existed. In the deep heart of Panthalassa, far from coasts, storms would have brewed that no one ever saw. Waves would have rolled for weeks or months, never striking land, only circling and circling, building power and losing it again. Perhaps entire chains of floating kelp forests or rafts of pumice from volcanic eruptions drifted there, unseen by any human eye. Great whales, if they evolved in such a world, would have swum across distances so vast they might have lived their entire lives without ever brushing ashore. The ocean would not be divided into familiar regions with different names. It would be one, whole and undivided, as if Earth itself carried two halves. One half land, one half water, each balancing the other. For creatures of the sea, this endlessness would have meant opportunity. Fish and whales and plankton might have spread evenly across the entire globe, instead of being shaped by the barriers of continents. Migration routes could have stretched thousands of miles without interruption. The richness of life might have been astonishing, yet strangely uniform, the same creatures appearing no matter which coast you approached. In our world, isolation gave rise to strange wonders, reef fish unique to the Pacific, crustaceans found only in the Atlantic, corals that grew only in certain seas. But in Panthalassa, such uniqueness might never have been born. The ocean would have been a single cradle, rocking the same species across all its shores. And what of exploration? In our history, oceans spurred discovery. They separated people, but they also made them curious. The Polynesians crossed the Pacific by reading the stars and waves, the Vikings reached across the Atlantic in wooden ships, and later, entire empires rose on naval power. None of that might have happened in a Pangea Earth. Exploration might have turned inward, across the continent rather than outward into the sea. Great journeys would have been treks across deserts, expeditions into mountain ranges, pilgrimages along rivers. The ocean would remain what it always had been, too vast, too infinite, too indifferent to invite. Perhaps only in the modern age, with machines and science, would humanity have finally begun to cross Panthalassa, discovering that on the far side of the water there was not another land, but the same coast they had left behind, circling back around the world. The psychology of living beside such an ocean is a fascinating thing to imagine. Today, we think of the sea as something that connects us, a pathway between continents. On Pangea, it would feel like the opposite, a great wall that surrounded the world. To walk inland meant possibility, neighbours, trade, diversity of land and life. To look outward toward the ocean meant finality, the end of land, the edge of what was knowable. The ocean might have carried a kind of sacred weight, treated with reverence or with fear, worshipped as the unbroken circle that held the world together. And yet, as with all things on Earth, it would not remain entirely silent. Winds would blow across its surface, shaping climates along the edges of the supercontinent. Tides would rise and fall, reminding people that even the endless ocean obeyed a rhythm. The moon would still pull on it, lifting and lowering its surface with steady patience. The sound of waves would still be the same sound it is today, water meeting land, the eternal hush that comforts even as it reminds us of our smallness. That sound, that rhythm, would have followed humanity no matter what shape the continents took. It is one of the few constants between the Earth that was and the Earth that might have been. So when we think of Pangea never breaking apart, it is not only the land we must imagine, but the water that held it. Panthalassa would have been as much a character in that story as the supercontinent itself. Vast, mysterious, humbling. It would have circled humanity with its blue horizon, offering both nourishment and limits, both comfort and awe. To live beside it would have been to live always in the presence of infinity. And perhaps that is why the idea of one endless ocean feels so dreamlike now, because even in our fractured world of many seas, we can still hear the whisper of what once was, and what might have been if the ocean had remained whole. Chapter 3. Climate without separation. To imagine Pangea as a single unbroken landmass is also to imagine a world with a very different climate. The Earth's weather is not random. It is a careful dance between land, ocean, air, and sunlight. In our world, the continents are scattered like islands across the globe, shaping winds, splitting ocean currents, and creating countless regional climates. But if all those continents were gathered into one, as Pangea was, and if they had never split apart, then the climate of Earth would have been a very different story, more extreme in some ways, more uniform in others, a pattern of weather that might feel both alien and strangely inevitable. Start with the sheer size of the land. Today, no point on Earth is more than a few hundred miles from the sea, and oceans help regulate temperature, carrying warmth and moisture inland. But on Pangea, the interior of the supercontinent stretched thousands of miles from the nearest coast. Without the ocean's moderating influence, the centre of Pangea would have been harsh. Summers would blaze with heat that baked the soil dry, while winters would plunge into cold as bitter as any tundra. The land's sheer breadth would create a desert core, vast, dry, and unyielding, larger than the Sahara, the Gobi, and the Kalahari combined. Winds might sweep across it for weeks, carrying dust that dimmed the skies at the edges of the continent. Rain would rarely reach it, falling instead along the coasts where moist air from the sea first touched land. To walk through that interior would be to step into a realm of extremes, a place where survival was never guaranteed. Now picture the edges of Pangea. Along the coasts, the climate would be more forgiving, nourished by moisture from the endless ocean that wrapped the supercontinent. Forests would thrive here, perhaps stretching in unbroken green belts for thousands of miles. Rivers, fed by rain and snowmelt from mountain ranges, would carve valleys where life could flourish. These coastal regions would have been the most habitable zones for early humans, animals, and plants alike. Unlike today, where coasts belong to separate continents and cultures, on Pangea the coastline would have been one continuous ring, a ribbon of life circling the world. Yet even here, the climate would be shaped by the size of the ocean beside it. Storms born in Panthalassa might rage along the coasts with a power beyond anything we know. Hurricanes that circled the world before breaking on land, monsoons that drenched entire regions for months at a time. Living on the edge of Pangea might have meant learning to live with the ocean's moods in a way even our ancestors never had to. The mountains of Pangea would also have told their own story. When continents collide, mountains rise, and on a supercontinent, collisions happened on a grand scale. Imagine ranges taller than the Himalayas, stretching in chains that cut across the heart of the land, blocking winds and reshaping climates. On one side of a mountain chain, fertile valleys might have bloomed with forests and rivers. On the other, deserts might have stretched endlessly, denied the moisture carried by prevailing winds. Entire ecosystems would have depended on which side of a mountain range they belonged to. For human beings, these ranges would have been more than barriers of stone. They would have been borders between worlds of climate. Crossing from one side to the other might have meant stepping from green abundance into barren sand, from wet monsoon to frozen wasteland. The poles too would have played a role. On today's Earth, the arrangement of continents helped shape ice caps. Antarctica, isolated at the bottom of the globe, became a frozen continent wrapped in currents of cold water. But on a Pangea Earth, things might have been different. Parts of the supercontinent extended close to the poles, meaning ice sheets could have spread across land far larger than Antarctica today. These frozen regions would have reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the planet further and feeding cycles of ice ages. At the same time, the equator, stretched unbroken across Pangea, might have been hotter than anything we know, a vast belt of tropical heat that baked jungles and deserts alike. The contrast between poles and equator would have been sharper, climates more polarized, extremes more pronounced. For the creatures of Earth, such climates would have been both a challenge and a shaper of life. In our own history, isolated continents produced unique species: marsupials in Australia, elephants in Africa, sloths in South America. But on Pangea, with no seas to divide them, species would have spread across vast distances, adapting to different climates rather than different continents. You might find the same herds of grazing animals stretching from one end of the land to the other, altered only in size or colour by the climate they lived in. Predators might have hunted across thousands of miles, following prey across deserts, forests and plains. Without isolation, life would have been less diverse but more universal, shaped by weather patterns rather than geography. And what about humanity? If we had emerged on Pangea, our story would have been written in the language of climate. The harsh deserts of the interior might have remained uninhabited for millennia, forbidding to early humans. Migration would have followed rivers and coasts, spreading along fertile edges before daring to cross mountain ranges into new climates. Civilizations would have risen where rivers carved fertile valleys out of otherwise harsh terrain, their agriculture shaped by the timing of monsoons and the flood of snowmelt. Unlike today, where civilizations grew apart on different continents, on Pangea they might have spread like ripples across a pond, linked not by ships but by long overland journeys. Climate would still divide them, but those divisions would have been drawn by deserts, mountains and storms rather than oceans. It is worth imagining how this would shape culture. In our world, isolation created diversity, languages, religions, and traditions blossomed in different corners of the world, separated by seas. On Pangea, cultures would still have been diverse, but their boundaries would follow climate zones. One culture might stretch across an entire desert, another across a monsoon-fed belt of forest, another along an endless river. Instead of thinking in terms of continents, people might have thought in terms of climates. To them, the world would not be divided into Africa, Asia, or Europe, but into belts of heat, belts of rain, belts of cold. Geography would still shape identity, but in a different way, one tied to the breath of weather. Of course, climate is not just about survival, it is also about imagination. The endless deserts of Pangea's interior might have inspired myths of barren gods, spirits of sand and dust who ruled with harsh indifference. The fertile coastal forests might have inspired myths of abundance, gods of rivers and trees who nurtured life. Storms from Panthalassa, circling the world, might have been seen as signs of great celestial battles. Even the regular rhythm of monsoons could have shaped spiritual life, tying rituals and harvests to the pulse of rain. Climate does not only mold ecosystems, it molds the way people think, the way they tell stories about their place in the world. As we drift through this imagined Earth, we can feel the strangeness of it pressing gently against us. A world without separated continents would be a world of sharper extremes: deserts larger, storms stronger, ice sheets broader, jungles thicker. And yet, it would also be a world of greater continuity, where climates stretched for thousands of miles in unbroken belts, where the same winds circled entire hemispheres, where the same storms touched coasts half a world apart. It would be familiar and unfamiliar at once, a reflection of our own Earth seen in a mirror slightly warped by possibility. And so we leave this thought to linger for a while. Pangea was not only a single land, it was a single climate system, vast and unbroken, shaping life in ways we can barely guess. If it had never broken apart, perhaps humanity would live today in a world more extreme, more uniform, and more bound to the rhythms of weather than the world we know. As we drift onward in our journey tonight, carry with you the image of deserts without end, storms without boundaries, forests without interruption, the climate of a world where Pangea still holds itself together. Chapter 4. Animal Paths. When we think about the animals of our world, it is easy to picture them where they belong. Kangaroos in Australia, elephants in Africa, llamas in South America, moose in the forests of Canada. These associations feel natural, as though the creatures were born for their landscapes. But the truth is that the oceans, those broad blue boundaries, are what gave rise to this pattern. Isolation shaped evolution. Creatures marooned on one continent adapted in ways that others elsewhere could not. But if Pangea had never broken apart, There would have been no isolation, no separate laboratories of life. Instead, animals would have shared one land, one stage, one vast set of pathways stretching across the world. To imagine such a place is to imagine not just herds and flocks, but great animal migrations beyond anything we know, journeys that spanned half the earth. Begin with the grazers. Today we know the spectacle of wildebeest herds in Africa, stretching to the horizon, moving with the seasons to follow rain and grass. Now, magnify that by 10 or even 100. On Pangea, without seas to halt them, herds might have roamed from one end of the supercontinent to the other, grazing across grasslands that continued for thousands of miles. Imagine a living tide of animals, thundering hooves rolling like distant thunder, rivers crossed, mountains skirted, deserts tested at their edges. Their trails would become etched into the land, broad paths trodden by countless generations. In time, these trails might have shaped the very geography of human settlement. Just as rivers guided where people built their homes, animal paths might have laid down the highways of early Pangean life. Predators, of course, would follow. Lions today are kings of the African savanna, but on Pangea they might have roamed far beyond. Packs of great cats, wolves, or other predators would have tracked the herds over astonishing distances, adapting to forests, grasslands, and even high plateaus. Instead of predators confined to one continent, there might have been fewer species overall, but they would have been widespread, a handful of apex hunters ruling the entire land. Imagine seeing the same predator in climates half a world apart, the same familiar silhouette stalking through snow and sand alike. The universality of such animals would have given them an almost mythic presence, a shared character in every culture's story. Without isolation, many of the creatures we know today would not exist at all. Australia's marsupials, shaped by millions of years apart from placental mammals, might never have had the chance to flourish. Madagascar's lemurs, born of separation, might never have appeared. South America's giant sloths, saber-toothed marsupial predators, and terror birds might have been outcompeted early by animals spreading freely across the supercontinent. The uniqueness of islands and isolated continents would vanish, replaced by a narrower cast of characters spread across wider stages. Life would be less diverse in form, but far greater in scale. Instead of pockets of strangeness, the world would carry fewer but larger dramas, each one written across thousands of miles. Consider the birds. Today, flight allows them to cross oceans, but many remain tied to their continents of origin. In Pangea, with no seas to limit them, their migrations might have been astonishing. Picture flocks darkening the skies for days, moving from one climate zone to another, following the rhythms of monsoons, deserts, and forests. Some might have flown from the equator to the poles and back again, tracing loops as wide as the world itself. Their songs, carried across lands and cultures, would have been familiar to everyone. A bird recognized in one village would be the same bird seen by another village 1,000 miles away. The continuity of life would have been a thread stitching the supercontinent together. And then, think of the small creatures. Insects, reptiles, amphibians. These too would have spread without oceans to halt them. Perhaps species would have been more uniform across the world, yet their sheer numbers would make them ever present. Ants would march in endless colonies. Beetles would spread across deserts and forests alike. Frogs might croak in nearly every wetland from one end of Pangea to the other. For early humans, these creatures would have been both companions and challenges, a constant presence no matter where they roamed. A traveller crossing the supercontinent might not encounter strange new species, but familiar ones appearing again and again, reminding them of the unity of the land. There is also the question of paths unseen, the migrations of the sea. In our world, the separation of oceans created unique marine life, but on Panthalassa, the one endless sea, migration might have followed even grander routes. Whales, fish, and turtles might have circled the globe without interruption, returning to the same shores across thousands of miles. For coastal humans, these recurring presences would have been markers of time, almost like seasons embodied in living form. To see the same animals return year after year, no matter which coast you lived on, would reinforce the sense of a unified world. For humanity, the presence of shared animal paths would shape culture in profound ways. Myths often grow from encounters with creatures, and if those creatures were the same across the entire land, then myths might have carried a remarkable similarity no matter where they arose. Imagine stories of the same predator whispered across countless villages, songs of the same migrating birds sung in languages thousands of miles apart. Instead of each culture forming its own separate pantheon of animals, there might have been a shared bestiary, a common language of creatures that bound humanity together. The wolf, the lion, the eagle, figures known not locally but universally. Hunting too would have been different. In our history, human hunters adapted to local prey. Mammoths in one land, antelope in another, giant kangaroos in yet another. On Pangea, hunters might have pursued the same herds across vast distances. Techniques developed in one region might have spread easily across the land, carried by travelers who followed the herds. Fire, traps, bows, and later domesticated animals might have become widespread more quickly, because the prey they were used against was everywhere the same. The universality of prey and predator might have made human innovation more connected, more shared. Domestication also would have taken on a different shape. In our world, certain regions had animals suited to domestication: horses in Eurasia, llamas in South America, none in Australia. On Pangea, suitable animals would have been available across the entire land. Horses, cattle, goats, and dogs might have been domesticated earlier and more widely, spreading across the supercontinent with astonishing speed. Agriculture paired with animal power might have risen faster, civilizations forming not in scattered cradles but along continuous belts of fertile land. The paths of animals, once natural migrations, might have become trade routes and caravan roads, carrying goods and people along the same trails once walked by herds. Even in the quiet details of daily life, animals shape the human story. The insects that buzz around fires, the birds that call at dawn, the predators whose eyes glow at night. All these would have been shared experiences across Pangea. Imagine children in distant villages hearing the same bird at morning, their parents telling the same cautionary tales about the same predator, their hunters walking the same great paths of migration. Instead of difference, there would have been recognition, a sense that the living world was not divided into strange pockets but was one vast, continuous presence. And yet, perhaps there is a different side to this. Diversity has always given resilience. When continents are separate, disasters in one place do not erase life everywhere. On Pangea, with animals spread across one land, a disease or a sudden climate shift could sweep more easily across the entire world. A plague among herds might have spread unbroken, affecting communities from one coast to the other. A predator driven extinct in one region might vanish everywhere. The unity of animal paths might have been both a strength and a weakness, creating a world where survival was shared more deeply, but also more fragile. So as we linger with this thought, let us picture the land not as empty or barren, but alive with movement. Herds flowing like rivers across plains, birds filling the skies in waves that darken the horizon, predators stalking quietly along the edges, insects humming in the air. All of them tracing paths that span not continents, but the entire world. In Pangea, animals would not be confined to corners of the earth, but spread across it in continuity, and for the humans who followed, those paths would be more than trails of survival. They would be the veins of culture, carrying connection and story across the supercontinent. Chapter 5. The Forest Belt. If Pangea had remained whole, one of its most striking features would have been the belts of forest that stretched unbroken across its surface. Today, forests are scattered across continents, shaped by oceans, mountains, and climates that cut them into separate pieces. The Amazon flourishes in South America, the Congo in Africa, the taiga stretches across Eurasia, each isolated by geography. But on a single supercontinent, the forests would have joined into colossal bands, flowing for thousands upon thousands of miles without interruption. Imagine walking into a woodland where the canopy above you never ends, where trees stretch from horizon to horizon, not for a country, not for a continent, but for half the planet. To step into such a forest would be to lose any sense of boundary. In our world, we think of forests as contained. The Amazon within its basin, the Black Forest within its mountains, the redwoods along a narrow coastline. But on Pangea, a forest could have sprawled across climates, shifting from tropical jungle into temperate woodland into boreal taiga without ever stopping. Picture beginning your journey among vines and orchids near the equator, listening to parrots cry above the canopy, As you walk north, the forest would shift beneath your feet. The trees would grow straighter, taller, the undergrowth thinner, the animals quieter. Still farther, the green would darken into conifers, the air cold and fragrant with pine. And still, you would not leave the trees. Weeks, months, even years of walking would carry you through forest without end. A single living skin stretched over the bones of the supercontinent. Forests are more than trees. They are entire worlds layered upon themselves. On Pangea, those layers would have been magnified into something unimaginable. The canopy would have been a continuous sky, stitched together by branches and leaves, home to countless species of birds, monkeys, insects, and creatures we can only dream of. The forest floor, damp and shadowed, would have carried the footsteps of great mammals, predators, and prey following the same paths worn for centuries. Rivers would thread through these forests, carving corridors of light and sound. In some places, waterfalls would plunge into hidden valleys, echoing against walls of green. In others, swamps and wetlands would stretch like mirrors beneath the trees, feeding frogs, turtles, and crocodiles. Life would not simply live in these forests. It would overflow, each layer feeding the next in an unbroken cycle. The continuity of these forests would have shaped evolution in profound ways. In our world, isolation gave rise to unique species. The lemurs of Madagascar, the orangutans of Borneo, the sloths of South America, all of them are products of separation. But on Pangea, the forests would have been unified. Species might have been fewer in number, but each one would have spread across astonishing ranges. Imagine the same bird flying above the canopy in regions thousands of miles apart, its song recognized by people who had never met. Imagine the same predator stalking monkeys in equatorial jungles and deer in northern woodlands, its form adapted slightly to the climate but still unmistakably the same. These forests would not have produced as many unique creatures, but they would have given the world a shared cast of characters known to all. For early humans, or any intelligent species that might have risen in such a world, the forest belts would have been both gift and challenge. They would have offered food, shelter, and water in abundance, yet they also would have been endless and confusing without natural borders to guide the traveller. Imagine walking through forest for months, never reaching an edge, never emerging into open land. Navigation would have required a deep intimacy with the trees themselves, reading moss on bark, listening for bird calls, following rivers and stars. Communities might have remained bound to rivers and clearings, where the land offered enough space to grow crops and build homes. The forest itself might have been regarded as sacred, a living presence too vast to conquer, too deep to fully know. The myths of such a world would almost certainly have been forest-born. In our own history, cultures living near forests often peopled them with spirits, guardians, or dangers. On Pangea, where forests were endless, these myths might have been nearly universal. The idea of the forest as a living being, watching, listening, and shaping human fate, would have been woven into the fabric of nearly every belief system. The canopy might have been imagined as the roof of the world, its roots as the bones of the earth, its animals as messengers or omens. People across thousands of miles might have told similar stories of spirits in the leaves, not because they shared direct contact, but because the same forest surrounded them all. Forests also shape the way humans use resources. In a world of Pangea, wood would have been abundant, perhaps more abundant than anything else. Entire civilizations might have risen on timber, building vast networks of wooden roads, bridges, and structures. Fires would have burned constantly, not for destruction, but for warmth, cooking, and industry. Ships, if they were ever built, would have come from these forests, though perhaps fewer in number, for the ocean was too vast to tempt early seafarers. Instead, the forest itself might have become the vessel, guiding people along rivers that served as highways through the green. Trade goods, resins, herbs, fruits, fibers would have flowed outward from the forests, feeding cultures along the coasts and plains. Yet the scale of the forests would also have presented dangers. With so many trees, fires might have spread with terrifying speed, consuming thousands of square miles before rains brought relief. Diseases carried by insects might have swept through populations living too closely beneath the canopy. Predators would have been ever present, lurking in shadows where the undergrowth muffled their steps. And still, people would have returned, drawn to the resources and mysteries of the woods, compelled to live within them despite the risks. In such a world, survival would have meant harmony with the forest, learning its rhythms, listening to its warnings, respecting its power. Even in modern times, had Pangea persisted, the forest belts would have shaped human progress. Imagine highways and railroads stretching not across open plains but beneath canopies of green. Imagine entire cities built within the forest, their buildings rising like trees themselves, shaped to blend into the surroundings. Perhaps societies would have become more forest-minded, preserving the resource that gave them everything, or perhaps they would have stripped it bare, creating scars across the supercontinent that could be seen from the sky. Climate change too would have been different. One continuous forest belt would have stored vast amounts of carbon, stabilizing the atmosphere. To cut it down would have been to shift the entire balance of Earth's climate at once, a single global wound rather than many smaller ones. As we rest in this thought, it is worth noticing how forests themselves mirror the dreamlike quality of speculation. To stand among trees is to feel both enclosed and infinite, both small and connected to something vast. They quiet the air, soften the light, and turn the mind inward. In a Pangea world, that feeling would have been magnified beyond measure. The forest would not be a place you entered and left, it would be the world itself, stretching across horizons, shaping life, thought, and memory. Humanity would not simply live beside forests, it would live within them, always. So, as we imagine the supercontinent tonight, let us picture not only the deserts of its core and the storms of its coasts, but the unbroken belts of forest that tied them together. Picture the canopy rising above you, endless and alive, a ceiling of green stretching across the earth. Picture the rivers winding beneath it, the animals moving silently through shadows, the songs of birds carrying for miles. This is the Pangea that might have been, a world where the forest was not one place among many, but the very fabric of the land itself. Chapter 6. Humanity's Origins. When we think of humanity's beginnings, our minds often travel to Africa, to the valleys and savannas where the first footprints of our kind were pressed into the earth. We picture early ancestors moving through grasslands, carrying tools of stone, watching the horizon for prey or danger. In our world, Africa became the cradle of humanity, because of the way the continents had drifted, because of the climates and ecosystems that formed there. But in a world where Pangea never broke apart, the question of where humanity would have emerged takes on a different shape. If there had been only one continent, with climates spread in vast belts rather than scattered patches, where would the story of us have begun? Would there still be a single cradle, or would multiple cradles bloom at once across the supercontinent, each giving rise to different beginnings of what we call human? Let us start by imagining the land itself. In the Pangea that never fragmented, the equator would still have been warm, wet, and green. Vast forests and savannas would have stretched across its belt, offering food, shelter, and water in abundance. These would have been the likely places for early primates to thrive, where the climbable trees and plentiful fruit provided both protection and sustenance. From these forests, some species might have ventured into open grasslands, experimenting with walking upright, adapting to new diets, and learning to survive in less sheltered environments. In our own timeline, that shift was crucial. It set the stage for bipedalism, for tool use, for cooperation. On Pangea, such shifts might have happened not in a single region, but in many, scattered along the equatorial forests of the supercontinent. Instead of one birthplace of humanity, there might have been several, each separated not by oceans but by deserts, mountains, and distance. Now imagine those early human-like beings spreading across the land. On our Earth, migration was shaped by the break of continents, oceans that blocked some paths, land bridges that opened others. But on Pangea, the paths would have been unbroken. A group leaving its home could walk endlessly across land, encountering new climates, new challenges, new resources. Some might have wandered into the deserts of the interior, where survival demanded toughness and innovation. Others might have followed rivers northward into temperate forests, where the seasons would teach them rhythm and patience. Still others might have climbed mountain ranges, adapting to thinner air and harsher conditions. Humanity would not have radiated outward in waves from one origin, but in overlapping ripples from many, spreading across the supercontinent in a great web of movement. This raises the possibility of something both beautiful and strange, that humanity as we know it might not have been one species, but many, born in different regions of Pangea. Without oceans to divide them, these different human-like groups might still have encountered one another, often mixing, sharing, competing, and merging. Perhaps there would have been no neat separation between species like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, or Homo sapiens. Instead, there might have been a vast continuum of human forms, evolving in parallel across the land, meeting and reshaping one another into a single yet diverse lineage. To look at another person might have been to see a slightly different reflection of yourself, taller or shorter, stronger or leaner, adapted to cold or heat, but still recognizably kin. The resources of Pangea would also have guided humanity's rise. Forest belts would have offered fruits, nuts, and animals to hunt. Grasslands would have provided grazing herds and opportunities for early domestication. Rivers and lakes would have given fish and fresh water. With no oceans to cut them off, these resources would have been accessible across immense distances, allowing humanity to spread widely without ever leaving land. This abundance might have encouraged larger groups, more stable settlements, and earlier experimentation with tools and fire. In our own history, humans took hundreds of thousands of years to develop complex societies. On Pangea, with greater continuity of resources, that process might have accelerated, driven by the constant movement and mixing of people across the land. But with abundance comes challenge. Diseases that in our world remained localized to certain regions might have swept across the entire supercontinent, carried by human migration. Without oceans to serve as natural quarantines, humanity might have faced pandemics from its earliest days, forcing cooperation and innovation in medicine and survival much earlier than in our timeline. Similarly, competition for resources might have been more direct. With fewer isolated regions to hide within, groups might have encountered one another more often, leading to both conflict and exchange. The human story might have been more entangled, less about isolated tribes slowly advancing, and more about great networks of interaction from the very beginning. And what of culture? In our fractured world, languages evolved separately, shaped by isolation. Myths, art, and rituals blossomed differently on each continent. On Pangea, the story might have been both simpler and grander. With humans spreading across the same land, their languages might still have splintered into thousands of tongues, but those tongues might have been more closely related, easier to understand across distance. Stories might have travelled farther, carried by wanderers who followed rivers and herds. Imagine a myth born near the equator, telling of a spirit in the forest, slowly travelling northward across generations until it reached people in cold pine forests. Imagine art styles and tools spreading quickly, not because of ships crossing seas, but because of footsteps crossing land. Humanity's cultures might have been more interconnected, their differences born of climate and landscape rather than separation by water. Domestication, too, would have been transformed. In our history, only certain regions had animals suited to domestication: horses in Eurasia, llamas in South America, none in Australia. This uneven distribution shaped empires and histories. On Pangea, those animals might have spread across the supercontinent together, available to many groups at once. Horses, cattle, sheep, and dogs could have become part of human life everywhere, not just in certain corners of the world. Agriculture, supported by animals, might have taken root earlier, spreading quickly along rivers and plains. Instead of scattered cradles of civilization, Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, Mesoamerica, there might have been one vast, continuous cradle stretching like a band across the fertile regions of Pangea. Humanity's rise might not have been a mosaic of separate centres, but a single woven fabric of progress. Still, there is a quiet question here. Would humanity have become more unified or less? On one hand, the constant mixing of groups might have created a sense of shared identity, a recognition of kinship across distance. On the other, the lack of separation might have fueled endless competition, with no oceans to enforce peace through distance. Perhaps empires would have risen earlier, spreading farther, fueled by the ability to march across unbroken land. Perhaps conflicts too would have been larger, engulfing regions that today would have been safely separated by seas. The story of humanity on Pangea might have been more intense, accelerated by contact, shaped by both cooperation and rivalry at scales far beyond our history. As we drift with this thought, it is worth noticing how fragile and contingent our own story has been. The drift of continents, the placement of oceans, the accidents of geography, all of these guided where humans arose, how we spread, and what we became. If Pangea had never broken apart, we might still exist, but we would not be the same. Our origins might not point to a single valley in Africa, but to a vast belt of land circling the equator, shared by countless groups rising together. Our migrations might not have been grand voyages across seas, but endless journeys across land. Our cultures might not have been separated by oceans, but braided into one another from the very beginning. And so, in the stillness of this moment, imagine a different story of us. One where humanity's cradle was not a single place, but a continuous land, where our first steps were taken not on isolated continents, but on a stage that spanned the earth. Imagine our ancestors looking outward, not at seas that blocked their path, but at horizons that promised more land, always more land. In such a world, the origins of humanity would not be a single dot on a map, but a belt of life stretching across the heart of Pangea, the beginning of a story written on one endless continent. Chapter 7. Language without oceans. Language is one of the most remarkable inventions of the human mind. It is not carved from stone or smelted from ore, but woven from breath and sound, built from nothing more than the vibrations of air between us. In our own world, oceans and continents shaped the rise of languages. Groups of people separated by seas developed their tongues in isolation, creating the vast diversity we know today. Thousands of distinct languages, each carrying its own rhythm, its own worldview. But in a world where Pangea never broke apart, the story of language would have been written differently. Without oceans as barriers, how would words have spread? Would languages have splintered into even greater diversity, or would they have woven together into fewer, broader families that stretched across the entire supercontinent? Imagine the earliest humans on Pangea, gathered in small groups around firelight. Their words were simple, perhaps no more than gestures and sounds, but even then, language was already doing its quiet work, naming, sharing, remembering. In our history, when groups wandered far enough to be cut off by seas or mountains, their words began to drift, evolving into new dialects, then into new languages. Isolation was the sculptor, carving difference from unity. But on Pangea, isolation would have been rarer. A group walking inland might have encountered others after days or weeks, not years or centuries. The land was continuous, and so too might have been the threads of language, carried across vast distances by wandering families, traders, and storytellers. It is possible, then, that languages on Pangea would have been fewer in number, but spread across greater regions. Imagine an entire belt of the supercontinent where one language family was spoken, stretching across thousands of miles. Differences would still appear. Of course, the way a word is pronounced, the rhythm of a phrase, the borrowing of new terms from neighbours, but those differences might have been more like variations in accent than complete transformations. People separated by enormous distances might still have recognised each other's words, the same way we can recognise family resemblance across faces. Communication across Pangea might have been easier, and cultures might have been more tightly connected by shared tongues. But there is another possibility, just as compelling. Without oceans to divide, the number of neighbouring groups might have been greater, not fewer. The ease of movement across the land might have created a patchwork of communities, each in constant contact with others, each borrowing and reshaping language at a faster pace. Instead of fewer languages, there might have been even more, spreading like colours across a canvas, each one shading into the next. Walking across Pangea might have meant moving through languages the way one moves through climates, slowly shifting, gradually changing, until a traveller found themselves speaking something entirely new without ever noticing the transition. Language would not have been fractured by seas, but braided by land, flowing in a continuous spectrum. Consider what that would have meant for storytelling. Stories are carried by words, but they are also carried by people, and on Pangea, stories could have travelled farther than in our world. A tale born in a village near a river might have wandered thousands of miles, retold and reshaped along the way, until it reached people who had never seen the original river, but still felt its presence in the story. Myths might have spread with remarkable speed, becoming shared across entire regions of the supercontinent. Instead of countless myths born in isolation, there might have been a smaller set of grand, universal stories known in different forms by nearly everyone. Perhaps they would be stories of the endless ocean surrounding the land, of the great forest that stretched without end, of the storms that circled the world. Humanity's imagination would have been shaped not by separation, but by continuity. And yet, Language is not only a bridge, it is also a mirror. The environment shapes what words we need, what sounds we use, what metaphors we carry. On Pangea, climates were vast belts stretching across the land, deserts, forests, grasslands, tundras. Each of these zones would have given rise to its own set of words, its own metaphors. A people living in deserts would carry language rich in terms for sand, wind, and scarcity. A people living in endless forests would carry words for shade, moss, and the sounds of birds. These words, carried across the land, would have painted culture in broad strokes. Language families might have been less tied to continents and more tied to climates, so that people living in far-apart deserts might share similar metaphors, while those living in far-apart forests might share similar songs. Trade, too, would have had its effect. On our Earth, trade across seas created lingua francas, shared languages used for exchange like Greek in the Mediterranean or Swahili along the East African coast. On Pangea, with one landmass, overland trade would have been even more important. Caravans following rivers or animal paths might have carried not only goods but also words, blending languages together in ways oceans never allowed. Over time, perhaps entire corridors of shared language would have developed, stretching across the supercontinent. The very act of trading salt, grain, or cloth would also have been the act of trading sounds, syllables, and meanings. It is fascinating to think how this might have changed humanity's sense of identity. In our fractured world, language became one of the clearest markers of difference. A different tongue meant a different people, a different world. Wars were fought over language, and borders were drawn along its lines. But on Pangea, where languages might have flowed more easily into one another, those borders might have been less rigid. People might have recognized the continuity of speech more often than its difference, hearing echoes of their own tongue in the words of strangers. The idea of humanity as one people might have been stronger, not because we were the same, but because the differences felt like shades of a shared whole, rather than divisions into separate parts. At the same time, it is worth remembering that language evolves with startling speed. Even without oceans, time itself is a kind of separation. A child hears words differently than a parent. A traveller borrows a phrase from a stranger. A community adapts its speech to suit its needs. Over centuries, those shifts accumulate. On Pangea, as in our world, language would still have branched and blossomed. The difference is that those branches might have intertwined more often, weaving together into a vast tapestry rather than standing apart as isolated trees. The sound of humanity might have been more like a chorus, thousands of voices blending into one great song, shifting in tone but still carrying the same underlying melody. As we linger with this thought, it becomes clear that language is not only about communication, it is about connection. It binds us to one another, and it binds us to the world around us. In a Pangea Earth, without oceans to scatter and isolate us, our words might have carried farther, our stories might have spread wider, and our voices might have resonated more deeply with one another. Perhaps we would still speak thousands of different tongues, but beneath them all would be the sense of a shared foundation, a recognition that we are one species telling one continuous story. So imagine yourself now, standing somewhere on Pangea, listening to voices drift across the air. Some are familiar, some are strange, but each carries echoes of the others, threads woven from the same ancient loom. You hear the laughter of children, the rhythm of traders bargaining, the chant of a storyteller repeating a tale told long ago in a place far away. You recognize in those voices the truth of language, that it is not merely sound, but the breath of connection, unbroken by oceans, spread across the endless land of a world where Pangea never let go. Chapter 8. Empires of a Supercontinent. Empires, in our own history, were shaped as much by geography as by ambition. Rome grew along the Mediterranean, stretching across coasts it could reach by ship. China rose behind mountains and rivers that bound it together as much as they set it apart. The empires of the Americas thrived within valleys and plateaus, limited by seas that kept them isolated from others. But what if the world had never been split by oceans? If all the land had remained united in one colossal continent? The story of empire in such a place would have been unlike anything we know. A story written not on fragments of earth but across the whole of it. A single canvas where ambition could grow without natural limits. To begin imagining this, picture a fertile river valley on Pangea, where early agriculture takes root. The rivers here do what rivers have always done. They feed the soil, they carry fish, they link people together. Settlements rise, trade flourishes, and slowly the first organized states form. But unlike in our world, where the spread of agriculture and empire eventually ran up against oceans, mountains, or distant lands, on Pangea these states would have had room to grow outward in nearly every direction. An early kingdom might have expanded across thousands of miles, swallowing forests, deserts, and plains, its borders stretching so far that the centre could barely govern the edges. The temptation to reach farther, always farther, would have been constant, for there would always be more land to claim, more rivers to follow, more valleys to cultivate. Such expansion would have made empires vast but also fragile. In our world, oceans acted as brakes, slowing the march of armies and forcing empires to consolidate before pushing outward. On Pangea, the absence of oceans would mean endless possibilities but also endless pressures. Communication would be slow, supply lines stretched thin, and rebellions frequent. Governing such distances would have demanded new innovations, perhaps earlier than in our own history. Written records, systems of taxation, messengers on horseback, perhaps even early versions of roads and postal systems long before Rome or Persia invented them. The need to hold together an empire that spanned thousands of miles might have been the very force that drove humanity toward complexity, forcing us to knit our societies tighter just to survive our own ambitions. It is tempting to imagine one great empire rising to rule all of Pangea, but perhaps the truth would have been different. The supercontinent was too vast, its climates too diverse, its peoples too many. More likely, it would have been a world of shifting giants, great empires rising in belts of fertile land, colliding with one another where their borders met. Along one river system, an empire might rise that stretched for 1,000 miles. Far to the north, another might form in the forests, trading timber and furs. In the deserts, a different power might emerge, hardened by scarcity, fierce and resilient. Each would grow until it met the others, and where they touched, there would be both war and exchange. The edges of these empires would become zones of fusion, where cultures blended, technologies were shared, and new ideas sparked. The map of Pangea would not show one empire covering all, but many overlapping circles of power, constantly expanding, colliding, and reforming. What would have made these empires different from ours is their sheer scale. Imagine armies not marching 100 miles but 10,000 across deserts and mountains to reach enemies. Imagine traders travelling for months along roads lined with caravanserais, carrying goods not just across regions but across the breadth of the supercontinent. Imagine capitals so far apart that news of one's rise or fall might take years to reach the other. For the people living in these empires, the world might have felt both immense and unified, vast beyond comprehension yet bound by the continuity of land. Cultural exchange on such a scale would have been extraordinary. In our world, the Silk Road linked China to the Mediterranean, a thread of trade that carried silk, spices, ideas, and religions across half the world. On Pangea, every empire would have had its own version of such a road, and they might have interlocked into a web of routes that spanned the entire continent. Knowledge discovered in one place, writing, metallurgy, mathematics, could have spread far faster, touching distant peoples in centuries rather than millennia. Perhaps the wheel would not have been invented once, but adopted widely across the supercontinent within a few generations. Perhaps writing systems would have spread quickly, linking cultures in networks of record-keeping and story. Human progress itself might have accelerated, driven by the ease with which ideas moved along the arteries of empire. And yet, with such vast connections, dangers too would have travelled farther. Diseases, carried by armies or traders, might have swept across Pangea with devastating speed. In our history, the Black Death moved from Asia to Europe in a matter of decades. On Pangea, a plague might have crossed the supercontinent in a single lifetime, reshaping empires and cultures as it went. The very interconnectedness that strengthened empires would also have made them vulnerable, binding them together not only in trade and knowledge but in suffering. It is worth imagining what daily life would have felt like in such empires. For most people, the empire would have been a distant presence, felt through the arrival of tax collectors, soldiers, or officials, but not truly seen. A farmer in a river valley might have heard of a capital city weeks away, but the name of the emperor might have been little more than a rumour. Yet the empire's reach would still be real, the language spoken, the currency used, the laws enforced, all shaped by a power far beyond the horizon. To live in such a place would have been to live in the shadow of something immense, something larger than any one life but carried forward by the actions of countless individuals. Religion and philosophy, too, would have been shaped by this scale. In our world, great religions arose in different corners, spreading outward over centuries. On Pangea, those religions might have travelled even farther, blending and competing across the supercontinent. A philosophy born in one empire might find echoes in another thousands of miles away, reshaped by new climates and cultures but still recognizable. Perhaps entire belief systems would have been nearly universal, known to people separated by deserts and forests, tied together by the web of empire. Ideas about justice, morality, and the meaning of life might have been shared more widely, carried across the land like seeds on the wind. And what of the ocean? In our history, oceans became the stage for empires. Spain, Britain, and Portugal rose on naval power, reaching across seas to claim colonies. But in a Pangea Earth with only one vast ocean too wide to tempt early ships, naval empires might never have come into being. The great powers of Pangea would have been land-based, their strength measured in roads, horses, and armies, not in sails and fleets. Expansion would have meant pushing inland, not outward. Exploration would have meant walking deeper into forests and deserts, not sailing into the horizon. The age of exploration might have been an age of caravans rather than ships, of journeys by land rather than sea. As we drift through this vision, it is worth noticing how empires always carry a dual nature. They bind people together, creating shared languages, roads, and systems of law. But they also create division, enforcing power, waging wars, demanding loyalty. On Pangea, these qualities would have been magnified, written larger than ever before. The empires of the supercontinent would have been vast beyond our imagination, their legacies felt across thousands of miles, their rise and fall shaping the entire human story. So picture it now, the endless land of Pangea, carved into vast realms of power, armies marching beneath banners, traders winding along endless roads, capitals rising in splendor only to fall into ruin. A world not of small, scattered empires, but of giants, colliding and reshaping each other across the single continent of Earth. To live in such a world would have been to live always in the shadow of empire, its reach both uniting and dividing, binding the fate of humanity to the vastness of land itself. Chapter 9. No need for ships. Throughout our own history, ships have been both tools and symbols of human ambition. They carried us across rivers, lakes, and oceans, linking continents that otherwise would have remained apart. They became instruments of trade, conquest, and exploration, their sails catching not only the wind, but the imagination of entire civilizations. Yet in a world where Pangea never broke apart, ships might not have mattered nearly as much. With no oceans separating human communities, the story of our technology would have been written differently. Instead of sails and masts, it might have been wheels, roads, and beasts of burden that became the great inventions of progress. The ocean would still exist, vast and endless, but in practical terms, it would not have been the highway it became. In our world, it would have been the horizon, the edge, the place where journeys stopped. Imagine the daily life of early humans on Pangea. To travel, they would not have needed boats to reach new lands. A group could walk, carrying what they needed, moving across forests, grasslands, or deserts until they encountered other groups. Rivers would still be obstacles, yes, but not oceans. A raft or canoe would have been enough for those crossings. The idea of venturing out onto the endless ocean, one without nearby islands, one that circled the entire planet, would have seemed impossible, even foolish. Why risk the unknown of unbroken water when all the riches of land stretched endlessly before you? The need that drove our ancestors to carve boats and risk waves simply would not have been as pressing. This does not mean ships would never have been invented, but their role would have been smaller. They might have been confined to rivers and coasts, useful for fishing and for connecting communities along shorelines, but never the engines of empire or discovery. There would be no Mediterranean filled with traders, no Viking longships crossing to new lands, no great fleets setting out to explore the world. Instead, the heart of movement would have been land itself. The camel, the horse, the ox, these would have been the vessels of humanity, their hooves and strength carrying people and goods across the supercontinent. Roads, not ships, would have been the arteries of civilization, stretching like veins across deserts and forests, linking distant empires not through ports but through crossroads. Think of how this would have changed the pace of discovery. On our Earth, the age of exploration was driven by ships, by the possibility of finding new lands beyond the horizon. On Pangea, there would have been no such age. Discovery would have been continuous, but it would have taken the form of walking, riding, and following trails. Exploration would have been less about sudden leaps across seas and more about slow expansion across land. There would have been no surprise of stumbling upon an entirely new continent, no shock of meeting people utterly separated by oceans for millennia. Every discovery would have been connected, another thread woven into the single fabric of the supercontinent. The world might have felt less like a patchwork of unknowns and more like a continuous whole, vast but unified. Trade, too, would have followed a different rhythm. In our history, maritime trade allowed goods to travel cheaply and quickly across long distances. Spices from Asia reached Europe by ship, silver from the Americas crossed to Spain, cotton from India flowed across oceans. On Pangea, those goods would have moved by land. Great caravans would have stretched for miles, loaded with goods, guarded by soldiers, sustained by rivers and oases along the way. The scale of these caravans might have dwarfed the Silk Road, turning entire highways into moving rivers of people and cargo. Markets would have grown not in port cities but in inland crossroads, where the great overland routes met. A city in the heart of Pangea, far from any ocean, might have been as rich and cosmopolitan as Venice or Alexandria in our history. The absence of ships as central tools might also have slowed certain kinds of innovation. Navigation, for example, developed partly because sailors needed to know their position at sea, to read stars, to measure distance without landmarks. On Pangea, with no long ocean voyages, such skills might have developed later, or in different forms. Astronomy might still have grown, but as a tool for agriculture and religion rather than for navigation. Mathematics, too, might have followed a different path, driven less by the geometry of sails and more by the engineering of roads and bridges. Technology would not have been less advanced, but its focus would have been different land-based rather than sea-based, grounded in the challenges of soil, stone, and animal power rather than wind and wave. Yet there is something else to consider. The absence of ships would not have meant the absence of wonder about the sea. People would still have stood on shorelines, gazing at the horizon, listening to waves. They might not have sailed across Panthalassa, but they would have dreamed of what lay beyond. The ocean might have taken on an even greater symbolic weight, becoming not a highway but a mystery, a boundary too vast to cross. Religions and myths might have imagined gods living beyond the waters, or the sea itself as the body of a deity that surrounded the world. To a people bound to land, the sea might have seemed even more otherworldly, a reminder of the infinite and the unknowable. This shift in perspective might have altered the shape of human ambition. On our Earth, once the continents were reached, people turned outward, toward the stars. On Pangea, with no seas to cross, perhaps that turn would have come sooner. If the entire land was already connected, if there were no new continents to discover, then humanity might have looked upward earlier, seeking wonder in the skies rather than across the waves. Astronomy might have leapt forward as a science of exploration, not because of ships, but because of the hunger for something beyond the land and the endless ocean that framed it. In this way, the absence of ships might have brought space into our story more quickly. It is also worth wondering how this would have changed our relationship with one another. Ships allowed for sudden encounters, Europe meeting the Americas, Asia linking to Africa and Europe through seas. These encounters were often violent, reshaping history in abrupt and dramatic ways. On Pangea, with no ships bridging isolated worlds, there would have been no sudden encounters, no shocks of discovery, no conquest of continents separated for millennia. Instead, contact would have been gradual, continuous, a slow blending across land. Human history might have been less dramatic but also less destructive, its conflicts large but not catastrophic on the same global scale. The absence of ships might have spared humanity some of its sharpest ruptures, replacing them with slower, steadier forms of change. As we linger with this thought, imagine yourself travelling across Pangea. You are not boarding a ship, not lifting a sail into the wind. You are walking or riding, following a road worn smooth by countless feet before you. Around you stretch caravans of traders, pilgrims, families seeking new homes. At the crossroads, You meet strangers who are not entirely strange, their language carrying echoes of your own, their goods familiar even if their faces are not. The world feels vast, but it also feels whole. The sea is still there, rolling against the edges of the land, but it is not the stage of your life. Your stage is the earth beneath your feet, the endless continent itself. In such a world, ships would not be the symbols of adventure they became in ours. They would remain small, hugging coasts, carrying fishermen and traders along rivers, useful but never transformative. Instead, the true symbols of human progress would be the roads carved across the land, the caravans moving like rivers of people, the animals that carried us forward, and the stories we shared as we walked. Humanity's destiny would not have been written on sails catching the wind, but on footsteps pressing into the soil of one unbroken earth. Chapter 10. The hidden role of isolation. When we look at the map of our own world, we see separation everywhere. Oceans divide continents, mountains wall off valleys, deserts spread like seas of sand that keep people apart. This isolation has been one of the quiet architects of history. It has shaped our languages, our cultures, our food, our beliefs. In one place, rice became the foundation of survival. In another, maize. In yet another, wheat or barley. In one land, bronze was discovered. In another, iron. In our fractured world, distance and separation gave rise to diversity. But in a world where Pangea never broke apart, that hidden hand of isolation would not have worked in the same way. The question then becomes, what would we lose without it? What would we gain? Imagine Pangea as a place of constant continuity. You walk across land for thousands of miles and encounter climates that change, landscapes that shift, but you are always connected. Rivers lead into other rivers, paths into other paths, people into other people. The sheer vastness means you can still go a lifetime without meeting someone from the far side of the continent, but you know they are there, part of the same land. There are no new continents waiting beyond seas, no hidden worlds untouched for millennia. Everything is, in a sense, already one, and while this unity brings connection, it also robs the world of one of its greatest teachers, isolation. Isolation forces invention. On our Earth, when a community is cut off from others, it must solve its problems alone. This solitude breeds innovation. The Inca in South America built roads and terraces suited to their mountains, while in Africa, metalwork developed under entirely different traditions. In Asia, rice cultivation reshaped landscapes, while in North America, maize agriculture spread with its own rhythm. None of these people could rely on borrowed solutions from across the sea. They had to imagine their own. This is why our world is filled with so many unique inventions, so many distinct ways of being human. Without isolation, much of this creative divergence might never have existed. On Pangea, where ideas and tools could spread more freely across land, cultures might have borrowed more often than they created anew. There might have been fewer paths to progress, fewer experiments running in parallel, and yet, there is another side. While isolation sparks invention, it also traps it. In our history, some discoveries never spread because oceans stood in the way. The wheel was unknown in the Americas until after European contact. Ironworking developed in Africa and Eurasia but did not reach isolated lands. Written language blossomed in some places and never in others. Isolation preserved diversity, but it also created unevenness. Entire societies rising or falling based on what they did or did not inherit. On Pangea, there would have been less of this unevenness. Once something was invented, a tool, a crop, a method, it might have spread widely, carried along roads and rivers, reaching distant peoples in a matter of generations. Perhaps progress overall would have been steadier, less fragmented, less punctuated by leaps and gaps. But the absence of isolation would not only have shaped technology, it would have shaped culture and identity too. On our Earth, cultures often grew strong in their separation. They developed their own music, their own myths, their own traditions, untouched by neighbours until much later. That separation gave each culture a distinct flavour, a uniqueness born of distance. On Pangea, where contact was constant, those edges would blur. Cultures might have felt less like islands of identity and more like branches on a single tree, their songs and stories blending into one another. The myths of one region might quickly become the myths of another, not through conquest but through simple exchange. Human imagination might still have been diverse, but it would have carried more threads of similarity, fewer wild divergences. Think of language again. In our fractured world, tongues evolved apart, until some were so different that they seemed almost alien to one another. A word in one language carried no trace of a word in another. On Pangea, the differences might have been less stark. Dialects might still have splintered, but their closeness would remain visible, their kinship audible. A traveller could walk across thousands of miles and still hear echoes of their own speech in the words of strangers. This continuity might have fostered a stronger sense of shared humanity, a recognition that people are not so different after all. But it would also mean fewer radically different ways of thinking, fewer glimpses into minds shaped by total separation. Food, too, tells the story of isolation. Today, we take for granted the blending of crops. Potatoes from the Andes now feed the world. Rice from Asia is eaten everywhere. Maize from the Americas has become universal. But this only happened after oceans were crossed. Before that, each continent carried its own gifts, isolated from the rest. On Pangea, these gifts might have spread much earlier. Wheat, rice and maize might never have been separate staples. Instead, they might all have blended into the diets of early civilizations. Diversity in diet would have been wider, but the uniqueness of each region's cuisine would have been less. Imagine a world where everyone has always eaten a mixture of the same foods, where the distinctness of flavors never had the chance to take root in isolation. There is also the question of resilience. Diversity born of isolation gave humanity multiple strategies for survival. If one region collapsed, another might thrive. If one crop failed, another might sustain. On Pangea, with cultures and ecosystems more unified, collapse might have been more sweeping. A disease in crops could have spread across the entire supercontinent. A plague among humans might have reached everywhere, with no oceans to slow it. Isolation, for all its barriers, also served as protection. It gave the world compartments, safe zones where life could recover while others suffered. Without it, humanity might have been more vulnerable to global catastrophes. And yet, even with these risks, the absence of isolation might have brought humanity closer together in ways we can only imagine. Wars might still have been fought, but perhaps they would have been between neighbours who shared more in common. Differences might have been softer, conflicts less about otherness and more about resources. Perhaps the idea of humanity as one species, one family, might have been stronger, recognised not in abstract terms but in the daily reality of hearing echoes of yourself in every stranger. Isolation gave us diversity, but unity might have given us compassion, or at least a different kind of solidarity. As we linger in this thought, let us picture both sides. On one hand, a world without isolation might have been less colourful, less filled with wildly distinct ways of living. On the other, it might have been less divided, less prone to misunderstanding and alienation. The hidden role of isolation was to give us difference, and difference has been both our greatest richness and our greatest challenge. On Pangea, without it, humanity's story would have been smoother, more continuous, perhaps less dramatic, but also less fractured. So, imagine now, walking across Pangea, you meet strangers who are not entirely strange, who speak words that echo your own, who eat foods that taste familiar, who tell stories that resonate with something you have already heard. The world feels vast, but not divided. You realize that isolation, the great sculptor of difference, has been absent here, and in its place is a kind of continuity, a shared humanness stretched across one endless land. Chapter 11. Disease across the land. Everywhere that life gathers, so too do sicknesses. Viruses, bacteria, parasites and plagues are as old as life itself, drifting unseen through air and water, waiting for hosts to carry them forward. In our own history, oceans played a quiet role as barriers, slowing the spread of disease, isolating outbreaks, protecting some populations even as others suffered. The Black Death swept across Eurasia, but never reached the Americas until centuries later. Smallpox devastated the New World only after European ships carried it there. Isolation, for all its costs, acted as a shield. But in a world where Pangea never broke apart, where every human community lived on one endless continent, that shield would never have existed. Disease would have travelled as freely as people, sweeping across the land with little to hold it back. Imagine an early settlement along one of Pangea's great rivers. People gather to fish, to farm, to trade. In their closeness, sickness emerges, perhaps a parasite carried by water, perhaps a fever passed through contact. In our own world, such an illness might have burned itself out locally, unable to cross seas to distant peoples. On Pangea, however, travellers from nearby regions would carry it onward. Villages downriver would catch it within weeks. Herds of animals might carry it farther. Within a generation, what began as a small sickness in one valley could spread across thousands of miles, carried by footsteps, hooves, and trade goods. Humanity would have faced global plagues far earlier in its history, long before the modern era gave us words like pandemic. This constant presence of disease would have shaped humanity from the very beginning. Populations might have grown more slowly, as outbreaks regularly reduced their numbers. Communities would have had to adapt by developing stronger immunities, not as isolated regions, but as an entire species under the same pressures. In some ways, this could have made humanity hardier in the long run. Generations would have been shaped by survival against plagues, building resistance as a shared inheritance, but the cost would have been high. Entire cultures might have been lost, not through conquest, but through illness sweeping across the land, leaving ruins where once there was life. Trade, which would have been the arteries of Pangea, would have carried more than goods. Caravans of merchants moving along roads and rivers would have brought with them not only silks, metals and spices, but also invisible hitchhikers, pathogens clinging to their bodies, their animals, their wares. A market bustling in one city might have become the source of a sickness that spread across an empire, across a continent, across the world. On Pangea, the richness of exchange would always carry with it the risk of contagion. Commerce would be inseparable from exposure, prosperity always shadowed by vulnerability. The same would have been true of war. Armies do not travel alone, they carry their own diseases with them. In our history, invading forces often fell to local sicknesses before battles could be fought. On Pangea, wars might have been decided as much by plagues as by weapons, with entire legions collapsing under fevers caught far from home. And yet, because no group was truly isolated, these plagues would not have remained local for long. Returning soldiers might carry them back to their homelands, spreading them through cities and villages far from the front. War and disease would have been bound together, one amplifying the other, reshaping the course of empires. The absence of oceans as barriers also means that animal diseases would have crossed more easily into humans. On our Earth, isolated continents each carried their own set of domestic animals, and thus their own unique zoonotic diseases. In Pangea, with animals spread across the entire land, humanity would have been exposed to more of them more quickly. The first farmers might have faced not just one or two deadly plagues, but many at once, as their livestock carried pathogens from every corner of the supercontinent. Domestication would still have been transformative, but it might also have been far deadlier, forcing humans to live in constant negotiation with sickness. The very act of keeping animals might have been as much about survival against disease as it was about food and labour. Religion and culture, too, would have been touched by this constant presence of illness. In our world, plagues often reshaped belief. Gods blamed or implored, rituals born to ward off unseen forces, myths told to explain suffering. On Pangea, where disease was never far, such beliefs might have been even more central. Entire religions might have revolved around sickness and healing, their ceremonies focused on purification, their myths explaining the cycles of life and death as the hand of spirits carried by air and water. Priests and healers might have been the most important figures in society, their role to comfort the sick and guide the living through waves of contagion. To live on Pangea might have been to live with constant awareness of fragility, of the thin line between health and collapse. Medicine, in turn, might have advanced more quickly. The sheer necessity of facing plagues that swept across the supercontinent would have demanded innovation. Herbal remedies, quarantine practices, even early forms of vaccination might have arisen earlier than in our world. Born of desperation, communities that failed to adapt would have perished. Those that found even partial answers would have endured. Over generations, this trial by fire might have forged a humanity more skilled at managing disease, but also more cautious, more aware of the dangers of contact. Trust and fear would have been intertwined, every handshake or shared meal a reminder of unseen risks. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the very universality of disease would have fostered a stronger sense of unity. On our Earth, plagues often struck one region while sparing others, creating division and blame. On Pangea, everyone would have faced the same plagues together. The awareness that no one was safe, that illness respected no borders, might have encouraged greater cooperation. Trade routes might have included not only goods but also knowledge of healing. Empires might have funded systems of sanitation, not just for power but for survival. A sense of shared vulnerability might have fostered shared responsibility. Humanity learning early that it was not divided into separate worlds, but bound together on one land under the same sky of sickness and survival. And yet, even in such a world, there would have been moments of hope. Just as plagues pass, so too would recovery come. Families would rebuild, fields would be planted again, children would laugh where silence once fell. Humanity has always found a way to endure, to continue, to find meaning even in the shadow of death. On Pangea, this resilience might have been even stronger, born of centuries of living with plagues that touched everyone. Perhaps songs and stories would have carried themes of renewal, of surviving the cycle, of the return of life after devastation. Hope, too, would have been a constant presence, as enduring as the sicknesses that haunted the land. So let us pause with this image. A village in the heart of Pangea, struck by sickness yet rising again as the years pass. A caravan carrying goods across thousands of miles, and with it, invisible passengers no one could name. A healer gathering herbs in a forest, trying to understand what cannot be seen. A family mourning, then laughing again, life continuing despite the fragility. On our Earth, oceans slowed the spread of such stories. On Pangea, they would have been shared by all, part of the common fabric of humanity. Disease would have been one of the great teachers of the supercontinent, reminding us always of our vulnerability but also of our strength. Chapter 12. The shape of cities. Cities are humanity's most visible footprints upon the Earth. They are where ideas gather, where commerce flows, where art, science, and power concentrate. In our world, the placement and shape of cities have always been influenced by geography. Port cities thrived where ships could dock. River valleys grew into capitals where trade and agriculture flourished. Mountains shielded some cities, while others rose where caravan routes converged. Yet in a world where Pangea never split apart, the geography of cities would have followed a different logic. Without oceans dividing us into separate continents, without scattered coastlines shaping trade, the shape of cities on Pangea would have been larger, stranger, and perhaps even more continuous than anything we know. Imagine first the role of rivers. On Pangea, rivers would have been the lifelines of humanity, stretching across thousands of miles, carrying water, food, and transport. Entire chains of cities might have grown along a single river, connected like beads on a thread. Where rivers met, great urban centres would have formed, hubs of commerce and culture fed by the movement of goods and people. Instead of isolated civilizations forming in separate river valleys, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, there might have been one continuous belt of river cities, stretching across fertile zones of the supercontinent. These cities would not have been strangers to one another. Their markets might have carried goods from distant lands, their streets echoing with languages that blended across vast regions. Now, consider the absence of seafaring empires. In our history, cities like Athens, Venice, and Lisbon flourished because of their harbours. They rose to power by controlling maritime trade. On Pangea, such opportunities would have been fewer. The ocean was too vast to cross, too endless to encourage the same kind of coastal empires. Ports would still exist, but they would be smaller, oriented toward fishing and coastal trade rather than global networks. The true centres of power would have been inland, along the crossroads of land-based routes. Great inland capitals, far from any sea, might have been the beating hearts of civilization, fed by caravans that carried goods along roads, stretching like arteries through deserts and forests. Picture the sprawl of such cities. Without oceans to halt their growth, some might have expanded outward for miles upon miles, merging with neighbouring towns until they became something like mega-regions, continuous urban belts running along fertile valleys. Where today we see distinct cities separated by distance, on Pangea we might have seen entire corridors of urbanization, unbroken stretches of settlement filled with markets, workshops, temples, and homes. A traveller might have walked for days without ever leaving the noise of human life, passing seamlessly from one city to another, the land itself transformed into a living chain of human habitation. The architecture of these cities would have reflected their placement. Along rivers, bridges and aqueducts might have defined skylines. In deserts, shade structures and irrigation systems would have been central. Their design focused on harnessing every drop of water. In forests, buildings might have blended with trees, constructed from the endless timber available. Mountains, too, would have shaped their cities, creating fortress-like settlements carved into cliffs or perched on high plateaus. Unlike our world, where cities often developed unique architectural identities in isolation, Pangea's cities might have carried echoes of one another, connected by trade and shared techniques. An arch developed in one region might have been imitated thousands of miles away, a style of temple or palace spreading across the supercontinent as easily as pottery or cloth. Population density would also have taken a different form. In our history, isolated continents supported varied numbers of people, depending on crops, climate, and technology. On Pangea, with more connected systems of trade, surpluses from one region could have supported growth in another. Famines might have been mitigated more often, with grain and goods carried across land. Populations might have clustered in larger numbers, creating cities of staggering size far earlier than in our history. A Pangean city of 1 million people might not have been an anomaly in the ancient world, but a common feature of fertile belts. The energy of such populations would have accelerated invention, art, and governance, but also magnified the problems of disease, sanitation, and conflict. It is intriguing to imagine how transportation would have shaped these cities. Without the primacy of ships, roads would have been everything. Empires would have poured resources into building vast networks of stone-paved highways, stretching across thousands of miles, linking capitals and markets. Caravans pulled by animals would have filled these roads, and later wheeled carts and vehicles. Cities might have been designed not around harbours, but around great road junctions, where traffic converged from every direction. Instead of bustling docks filled with sails and rigging, the busiest quarters might have been sprawling caravanserais, where travellers rested, goods were exchanged, and stories from distant lands were told by firelight. Religion and culture would have followed the paths of these cities. In our world, beliefs often spread slowly, carried across seas, or adopted by isolated peoples in separate waves. On Pangea, the vast networks of cities would have acted like channels, spreading ideas quickly. A philosophy born in one city might have touched dozens more within a generation. Festivals, rituals, and art forms might have become nearly universal, recognized across enormous distances. At the same time, local variations would have flourished in detail, different dialects of a hymn, different colours in a festival. Yet the overarching culture might have felt more unified, tied together by the continuity of land and roads. And yet, the challenges of such cities would have been immense. Disease, already a constant presence on Pangea, would have found fertile ground in crowded streets. Fires might have swept through wooden districts, leaving devastation in their wake. Waste and water management would have been constant struggles, forcing early innovation in sanitation. The very scale of these cities would have magnified every problem, demanding solutions that required cooperation on an unprecedented level. Perhaps this would have driven humanity towards stronger governance, more complex systems of law, or more organized systems of defense and care. Perhaps cities would have been not just centers of power, but crucibles of survival where humanity learned again and again how to adapt. Even in the modern era, the shape of cities on Pangea would astonish us. Imagine an urban corridor stretching the length of a continent, with trains and highways connecting districts that were once separate empires. Imagine a capital that draws its power not from oceans, but from its position at the crossing of the world's great overland routes. Imagine skylines rising not in isolated regions, but in belts, each one echoing the others across the land. The Earth would not be divided into continents with their own centres of power, but into belts of cities, stretching across the same supercontinent, each one part of a larger whole. And as we rest with this thought, it becomes clear that cities are more than stone and wood. They are reflections of the land they inhabit, shaped by the barriers and bridges of geography. On our Earth, oceans carved the destiny of cities, making ports the jewels of empire. On Pangea, without oceans to divide, it would have been rivers, roads, and crossroads that shaped them. The shape of cities there would have been the shape of connection itself, unbroken, sprawling, continuous, humanity building not just in fragments, but across the skin of one vast land. Chapter 13. Boundaries without oceans. In our world, oceans have drawn many of the boundaries that define us. They are not only physical divisions, but psychological ones too. The Atlantic once separated the old world from the new. The Pacific stretches like a great silence between Asia and the Americas. Even within continents, seas and gulfs have marked distinctions. Mediterranean from Middle East, British Isles from mainland Europe. These waters are not walls in the strictest sense, for humans have always built ships to cross them, but they have been enough of a barrier to shape history, to delay encounters, to create difference. If Pangea had never broken apart, then those oceans would not exist as dividers. Instead, humanity would have learned to draw its boundaries elsewhere, carving the world not with seas but with deserts, mountains, and invisible lines of culture. Imagine standing in the center of the supercontinent. No coastlines shape your horizon. Instead, you are surrounded by land in every direction, its climates shifting as you move but never interrupted by the sea. In such a world, boundaries would have been born of necessity. Where a desert stretched wide and unforgiving, people on one side might have developed separately from those on the other. Where mountains rose snowy and impassable, they would have formed barriers as formidable as any ocean. Even vast forests could have served as divisions, their density slowing travel, muffling contact, creating natural separations between groups. The map of Pangea would not have shown neat continents surrounded by blue, but regions carved by terrain belts of life separated by belts of difficulty. Consider the role of deserts. The interior of Pangea, far from the ocean's moderating breath, would have been dry and extreme. Great deserts larger than any we know today would have sprawled across its middle, scorching in summer, freezing in winter, their sands stretching for hundreds of miles. To cross such places would have been perilous, limiting contact between those on either side. Cultures separated by deserts might have developed differently, their languages and traditions diverging as though they were on different continents. Yet unlike oceans, deserts can be crossed by those who prepare well. Caravans with supplies, guided by stars and landmarks, could make the journey. So while deserts would have created boundaries, they would have also become gateways, shaping networks of trade and migration that connected regions across hardship. Mountains too would have drawn their lines. On Pangea, the collision of tectonic plates would have raised ranges taller and broader than most we know today. These mountains would have been both protection and prison, shielding valleys while separating communities. A people on one side of a range might never have met those on the other, except through narrow passes that opened briefly in summer. Such passes would have become treasures, contested and controlled, their routes shaping trade and power. Mountain ranges would not have been edges of continents but seams of history, stitching together some regions while keeping others apart. The stories of these places would have echoed with both connection and division, borders made not by water but by stone. Forests would have been another kind of boundary. In our world, forests often served as frontiers, their depth and density discouraging conquest. On Pangea, where forests stretched unbroken for thousands of miles, they might have been as defining as seas. Imagine a belt of woodland so wide it took weeks to cross, its canopy dark, its paths unclear. Communities might have grown on its edges, trading with those who lived within but rarely venturing too far. The forest would have become its own kind of country, not marked on a map but felt in the slowness of movement, in the difference of culture between those who lived within its shade and those who lived beyond it. Beyond geography, boundaries on Pangea would have been drawn by culture itself. Language, religion, and tradition would still have marked divisions between people. On our Earth, oceans helped to exaggerate those differences, holding them apart until they were stark. On Pangea, where land allowed easier travel, those boundaries might have been more fluid. Cultures might have blended at their edges, creating zones of fusion rather than sharp breaks. Instead of abrupt shifts, there would have been gradients, dialects shading into one another, rituals borrowing from neighbours, ideas flowing outward in ripples. The borders of Pangea might not have been lines, but wide bands where difference softened into connection. Yet humanity also has a tendency to define itself against others, to mark divisions even where none are natural. On Pangea, Political boundaries might have been drawn not by seas but by human choice. Rivers would have served as borders between kingdoms, deserts as markers of empire, mountain passes as lines of defense. Great walls might have been built not to keep out invaders across oceans, but to control movement along land routes. The psychology of boundary making would have remained. Even if the tools changed, the absence of oceans would not have erased division. It would simply have relocated it to new landscapes. The scale of these boundaries would have been different. On our Earth, continents gave rise to distinct civilizations separated for centuries. On Pangea, separations might have been shorter-lived. The desert that kept people apart for generations might one day be crossed by a determined empire. A mountain pass that was once closed might be opened with new tools. The flow of history would have pressed constantly against boundaries, reshaping them, erasing some, and creating others. The sense of isolation might have been less permanent, less absolute. Boundaries would exist, but they would shift more quickly, like lines drawn in sand rather than carved into stone. This would have changed the way people thought of identity. On our Earth, many cultures see themselves as children of continents: African, Asian, European, American. On Pangea, such categories would not exist. Instead, people might have thought of themselves in terms of climate zones, or river systems, or belts of land. We are the people of the forest, one group might say. We are the people of the desert, another might answer. Identity would be tied to landscapes, not continents, to the barriers that shape daily life rather than to oceans that never divided them. At the same time, there would have been an awareness of unity. On one continent, the idea that humanity is part of a single land might have been easier to grasp. The ocean would still circle the edges, but it would not fragment the middle. Perhaps political boundaries would have been seen as temporary, fragile compared to the permanence of the land itself. Perhaps the sense of belonging would have been broader, tied to the entire supercontinent rather than to smaller regions. Or perhaps the opposite. Perhaps the absence of oceans would have made boundaries even more fiercely defended, as groups defined themselves against neighbours without the relief of distance. As we let this image settle, imagine walking along one of these boundaries. Perhaps you are standing at the edge of a desert, looking across to where another culture lives beyond the sands. Perhaps you are climbing a mountain pass, knowing that on the other side lies a valley with different customs, different voices. Perhaps you are moving through a forest, aware that every step carries you closer to strangers who are not entirely strange. On Pangea, boundaries would always be near, always negotiable, never as final as oceans. They would be both softer and sharper, shaping humanity in ways both familiar and strange. Chapter 14. Food and Farming. Food is one of the quiet foundations of civilization. The crops we plant, the animals we raise, the ways we cook, all of these decisions ripple outward into culture, technology, and even belief. In our history, geography shaped the diversity of food. The separation of continents meant that different plants and animals evolved in different places, giving rise to unique culinary traditions. Maize was born in the Americas, rice in Asia, wheat in the Fertile Crescent, yams and sorghum in Africa, potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, cocoa, coffee. Each of these treasures was once confined to a single land before ships carried them across oceans. But in a world where Pangea never broke apart, this separation would not have existed. The story of food and farming would have unfolded differently, shaped by a single connected land rather than scattered continents. Imagine the earliest farmers of Pangea. They stand at the edge of a fertile valley, planting seeds in soil dark with river silt. Around them, wild grains grow in abundance, fruits hang heavy from trees, and animals graze nearby. In our world, these first experiments in agriculture happened independently in several places. On Pangea, the fertile belts of the supercontinent might have seen many such beginnings, but instead of remaining separate for thousands of years, these discoveries could have spread more easily. A technique learned in one valley might have been carried to another 1,000 miles away within a few generations. Farming might not have been scattered into distinct cradles of civilization, but spread in long continuous belts, linking regions together with shared knowledge of soil, seed, and harvest. This would have changed the very foundation of diet. In our fractured world, each region developed its own staples. A meal in Mesoamerica might have centered on maize and beans, while one in Mesopotamia relied on barley and lentils. On Pangea, these staples might have mingled far earlier. Farmers in one part of the continent might have grown rice alongside wheat, maize alongside sorghum, blending traditions of cultivation into one. Diets would have been richer in diversity but less distinct in identity. Instead of unique cuisines tied to continents, there might have been a more universal table, shared by peoples across the supercontinent. Domestication of animals too would have been transformed. In our history, certain regions were blessed with animals suited for domestication, while others were not. Eurasia had horses, cattle, goats, and sheep. South America had llamas and alpacas. Australia had none suitable. These differences shaped entire civilizations, giving some societies advantages in transport, farming, and warfare. On Pangea, those animals would have roamed freely across the land. Early humans in many regions might have had access to the same herds, domesticating them simultaneously or adopting them from neighbours. The horse might have become universal far earlier, the ox and cow common companions in every fertile plain. Instead of uneven access, humanity would have shared more equally in the power of animals. Consider also the spread of techniques: irrigation, crop rotation, terrace farming. These innovations arose in specific regions in our world, then spread slowly across continents. On Pangea, such techniques would have travelled faster. A society farming in drylands might have developed irrigation, and within generations, others across the supercontinent would have adopted it. Knowledge of soil improvement, of seed selection, of storage and preservation might have become widespread far earlier. Farming would have advanced more quickly, sustained by the unbroken exchange of ideas across land. The rise of complex societies might have been accelerated, fueled by surpluses that grew more consistently across regions. And yet, there is another side to this story. Diversity in food is not just richness, it is resilience. On our Earth, the separation of continents meant that a blight in one crop could devastate one region but leave others untouched. When potatoes failed in Ireland, other continents were not harmed. When rice suffered in Asia, wheat still grew elsewhere. On Pangea, with crops spread more widely, the risk of collapse would have been greater. A disease striking wheat might have swept across the supercontinent, threatening harvests everywhere. A plague among cattle might have left millions without food or labour. The very unity that allowed abundance would also have carried fragility, tying all of humanity's survival to a smaller set of shared foundations. Food is more than sustenance, it is culture. The meals we share, the flavours we favour, the rituals around planting and harvest all shape who we are. In our world, isolation gave rise to cuisines so distinct that tasting them feels like entering another way of life. Spices in India, olives in the Mediterranean, maize in the Americas, cassava in Africa, each cuisine carries the memory of its land. On Pangea, cuisines might have been less distinct. Instead of radical difference, there might have been more blending, more shared traditions. Herbs, spices, and cooking methods could have travelled across thousands of miles, carried by caravans and traders, creating a culinary landscape that was broad and interconnected. People from distant regions might have shared flavours familiar to one another, a sense of recognition in every dish. But even in this blending, local character would have remained. Deserts would still have shaped how food was preserved, forests how it was gathered, rivers how it was cooked. Regional identities would still flavour meals, even if the staples were shared. One community might roast grains, another ferment them, another grind them into bread. One might favour spices, another herbs, another salt from inland deposits. The result would have been both sameness and difference, a culinary tapestry woven from common threads but patterned by local hands. Religion and ritual would also have carried the imprint of food. Harvest festivals might have been celebrated across the supercontinent, each tied to the rhythms of farming that were nearly universal. Offerings of wheat, rice, or cattle might have appeared in temples thousands of miles apart, echoing the same reverence for life-giving food. Myths about fertility, growth, and abundance might have been shared across cultures, born of the same agricultural cycles. Perhaps gods of harvest would have been more universal, worshipped in many forms but tied to the same staples, uniting humanity through shared rituals of planting and reaping. In the modern age, the shape of food on Pangea would astonish us. Imagine a world where global cuisine was born not through ships and globalization, but through the slow blending of traditions across land. Where coffee, chocolate, spices, and grains were never exotic imports, but everyday parts of a shared diet. where restaurants and markets in every city carried flavors familiar to all, less about novelty and more about variations of a common theme. The culinary map of Pangea would not be divided into continents, but into belts of climate and culture, each flavor shading into the next like colors across a single canvas. And yet, as we pause with this thought, it is clear that food would still have been more than survival. It would have been story, memory, connection. Families gathering at fires, communities sharing feasts, travelers tasting the foods of strangers and finding echoes of their own. On Pangea, food would have bound humanity together more tightly, weaving its flavors across the endless land, reminding us always that though we lived in different regions, we ate from the same earth. Chapter 15. Climate Belts. The Earth as we know it is divided into regions of climate that are scattered across continents, broken by oceans, and softened by coastlines. The tropics ring the equator, deserts bloom in subtropical zones, temperate forests spread in bands, and icy tundras crown the poles. Yet because the continents drift apart, these climates are distributed unevenly, split into fragments. Africa holds one desert, South America another. Asia carries vast steppes, while Australia shoulders its own dry heart. But in a world where Pangea never broke apart, these climates would not be scattered. They would form unbroken belts stretching from one side of the supercontinent to the other, immense ribbons of temperature, moisture, and wind wrapping around the globe like the stripes of some vast, living creature. Imagine first the equatorial forests. On Pangea, the equator would cut across the heart of the land, creating a belt of hot, wet air. Here, rains would fall in abundance, feeding forests so dense that they might stretch without interruption for thousands of miles. These would not be separate jungles like the Amazon or Congo, but one vast band of green encircling the Earth's waste. Within this forest, every tree and vine would connect to others, every bird and insect echoing across endless canopy. To step into this belt would be to enter a world of ceaseless growth, a realm where the forest itself was a continent, unbroken, alive, and ancient. Beyond the equatorial forests, deserts would spread. In our world, deserts exist in isolated places. The Sahara in Africa, the Gobi in Asia, the deserts of the American Southwest. On Pangea, the vast interior of the supercontinent would have been dry, cut off from the moderating influence of the ocean. Rains that fell near the coasts would rarely reach the center, leaving a barren core. This desert belt might have stretched across much of the land, an arid heart wider than anything we can imagine today. Crossing it would have been like crossing an entire world of sand and stone. Civilizations might have grown around its edges, trading goods across it the way we trade across oceans. The desert would not be a boundary of one land, but a sea of another kind, endless and consuming, shaping human imagination with its silence and its storms. To the north and south of these deserts, temperate zones would have unfurled like ribbons, belts of grassland and woodland stretching for thousands of miles. These would have been the breadbaskets of Pangea, fertile regions where crops flourished and animals grazed. Imagine an unbroken steppe extending from horizon to horizon, herds moving across it in vast migrations, farmers following rivers that snake through the grass. These temperate belts would have supported some of the largest human populations, their soils rich, their climates balanced, their resources abundant. In these zones, civilizations might have risen in great chains, their cities dotting the land like stars across a dark sky, linked by trade routes that carried food, culture, and power. Farther still, the forests of the north would have spread. Boreal belts, cold and vast, would have wrapped around the higher latitudes, endless pines and firs stretching in shadowy continuity. To live here would have meant long winters, short summers, and a life shaped by patience and endurance. These forests would have been rich in furs, timber, and game, feeding trade networks that reached into the warmer belts to the south. The people of these forests might have become traders, hunters, and storytellers, carrying the wisdom of survival through cold nights into the bustling markets of temperate cities. At the very edges of the world, ice would reign. The polar belts of Pangea would have been immense tundras, lands of snow and silence, where hardy creatures thrived and humans learned to endure the harshest conditions. These regions would have been the least populated, but not empty. People here would have been resilient, shaped by the extremes of their climate, their traditions carrying lessons of resourcefulness and respect for the fragile balance of life. Their boundaries would have been less cultural and more environmental. the line where cold becomes too much for crops, where the forest gives way to endless white. The striking feature of these climate belts is their continuity. In our fractured world, a desert is bordered by a sea or a forest, a temperate plain by a mountain or coast. On Pangea, the belts would not have ended so abruptly. They would have stretched like great rivers of climate, their edges soft and gradual. A traveller could walk from forest to desert, from grassland to tundra, not by crossing seas but by moving steadily across land. The experience of climate would have been one of progression, a slow unfolding of the Earth's moods, rather than abrupt changes cut by oceans. This continuity would have shaped culture. On our Earth, societies tied their identity to specific climates, and because those climates were often confined to continents, they grew in isolation. On Pangea, identities might have been tied not to continents but to belts. One group might have called themselves the people of the forest belt, another the people of the desert belt, another the people of the grassland belt. These identities would have spanned thousands of miles, connecting people across vast distances through shared climate and lifestyle. A farmer at one end of the temperate belt might have more in common with another farmer thousands of miles away than with their neighbour living just across the desert. Trade and travel would have followed these belts too. Caravans would have moved along temperate zones, linking city to city across thousands of miles. Hunters in the boreal forests would have carried furs southward, while desert traders moved salt and minerals toward the fertile edges. The belts themselves would have been highways, guiding the flow of goods and culture. They would also have been barriers, shaping the directions of expansion. Civilizations might have flourished in long ribbons rather than compact circles, their growth dictated by the climate zones they could inhabit. Even myth and story would have been shaped by these belts. In a world where climate stretched unbroken, the landscapes themselves would have seemed eternal, almost divine. The desert belt might have been imagined as a vast ocean of fire and sand, inhabited by spirits of heat and wind. The forest belt might have been seen as a living god, endless and watchful. The ice belt might have been revered as the realm of ancestors, where silence carried the voices of the past. Humanity's spiritual imagination would have been tied not to continents, but to the rhythms of climate belts that circled the world like great rings of identity and meaning. And so, as we rest with this image, imagine walking across Pangea, your path not broken by seas, but by climates. You begin in the deep forest, where rain falls every day and life hums around you. Step by step, the trees thin, and you enter the desert, the horizon burning with heat. Beyond that, grasslands open wide, dotted with rivers and herds. Farther still, the air cools, and pines rise in dark green ranks. Finally, you reach the edge of the ice, where the land itself seems to end in silence. In such a world, the earth would feel like a vast tapestry, its belts of climate, the threads, weaving together not continents but one continuous land under one continuous sky. Chapter 16. The Ocean Barrier. Even in a world where Pangea never split apart, the ocean would still have been there, circling everything in its endless embrace. Pangea, the single great sea, would have been Earth's most vast and unbroken feature, a true frontier beyond imagining. On our Earth, oceans became bridges as much as barriers, carrying ships between continents, allowing cultures to meet, clash and merge. But on Pangea, with no scattered lands to sail between, the ocean would have remained something different, not a passage, but an edge, a boundary too wide to tempt early explorers, too empty to reward their effort, a horizon that marked the end of the world. Imagine standing at the shore of Pangea. Behind you stretches the vastness of land, unbroken, filled with deserts, forests, rivers and cities. Before you lies water without end. There are no islands glittering in the distance, no hints of another coast, no promise that beyond the horizon lies anything at all. The sea is not an invitation here, but a silence, a reminder of limits. Fishermen might have worked the coasts, casting nets into shallow waters. Small boats might have hugged the shoreline, trading between nearby ports. But the deep ocean, the heart of Pangea, would have remained untouched. It would have been the great unknown, an expanse too vast for human ambition until very late in history. This ocean barrier would have shaped how humanity imagined the world. On our Earth, the discovery of new continents reshaped maps again and again, expanding horizons with each voyage. On Pangea, there would have been no such discoveries. The land was already all one, and the sea was simply the end of it. Maps might have shown detail inland but faded at the edges into nothing but waves. Myths might have filled the ocean with spirits or monsters, not as real lands waiting to be found, but as embodiments of the unknown. The ocean would have been less a stage for exploration and more a mirror of mystery, a symbol of the unreachable, the infinite. And yet, though the ocean would have been a barrier to travel, it would not have been irrelevant. It would still have shaped the climate of Pangea, carrying storms to the coasts, feeding monsoons and rains, shaping winds and temperatures across the land. Life along the edges of the continent would have been tied to its moods. Fishing villages would have sprung up where the sea was generous, while great storms would have brought both destruction and renewal. For coastal peoples, the ocean would have been an ever-present force, provider, destroyer, and mystery, all in one. But unlike in our world, it would not have connected them to distant lands. It would only have reminded them that beyond the edge was nothing but water. Trade, in particular, would have followed a different course. On our Earth, seas were highways of commerce. They carried silk, spices, gold, and knowledge across vast distances more easily than caravans could across deserts. On Pangea, with no nearby continents to reach, there would have been no maritime silk roads, no age of sail, no great naval empires. Trade would have been entirely land-based, guided by rivers, roads, and caravans. The sea might still have offered fish and salt, but it would not have been the medium of connection. It would have been the outer wall of civilization, a place where trade routes ended rather than began. This would also have shaped war. On our Earth, navies determined the fate of empires. Athens ruled the Aegean through its fleet. Britain rose to global dominance through its navy, and battles at sea decided the course of entire eras. On Pangea, such fleets would have been less significant. Wars would have been fought entirely on land, with armies marching across plains, deserts, and forests. Control of roads, rivers, and passes would have been more important than control of coasts. The ocean would still have mattered as a defensive boundary. No army could march across it, but it would not have been a stage for power. It would have been a wall, absolute and immovable. And yet, humans have always looked beyond what they can reach. Even on Pangea, people would have stood at the shore and wondered what lay across the waves. Some might have pushed out in boats, venturing farther and farther, only to find nothing but endless water. Others might have dreamed myths of distant lands, not because they had proof, but because imagination fills every empty horizon. Perhaps religions would have taught that the souls of the dead travel across the ocean, disappearing into eternity. Perhaps poets would have written of the sea as the border between life and the unknown, its horizon a symbol of both fear and hope. The ocean would have remained less a place to cross and more a place to contemplate. In the modern age, things might have shifted. With advances in navigation, fuel, and engineering, humanity might eventually have dared to cross Panthalassa. Even then, the scale of it would have been daunting. Journeys would last far longer, with no islands for respite. Exploration of the ocean would not have been driven by the promise of other continents, but by curiosity alone. Perhaps submarines and aircraft would have come into use earlier, as ways to probe the ocean without committing to endless voyages. Perhaps science rather than conquest would have been the great motivation to explore it. The ocean barrier, so absolute for most of history, might have become the last frontier of discovery, a reminder that even on one land, not everything is known. It is also worth imagining how the presence of one vast ocean would have shaped culture at large. In our world, seas gave us metaphors of journey, distance, and discovery. On Pangea, the metaphors might have been different. The ocean would have represented not connection, but limit. Stories might have spoken of heroes who reached the edge of the land and looked into eternity. Songs might have compared love, loss, or longing to the endless horizon. Philosophies might have reflected on the ocean as the ultimate unknown, the thing that cannot be crossed, the silence that surrounds all life. And yet, even if it remained uncrossed, the ocean would still have been part of daily life. Tides would have risen and fallen, shaping coasts. Fish would have been caught, shells gathered, salt harvested. Children would have played in the surf. Traders would have built markets by the shore. Lovers would have walked by moonlit waves. The ocean would still have been part of humanity's rhythm, not as a bridge but as a boundary that framed our world. It would have reminded us always of scale, of the vastness that lies beyond our reach. of the mystery that defines existence itself. So picture it now. The endless land of Pangea stretching behind you, filled with deserts, forests and cities. And before you, the endless water of Panthalassa, stretching to horizons you cannot imagine. You stand at the meeting of land and sea, aware that one is everything you know and the other is everything you cannot. In that moment, you feel the truth of the ocean barrier, not just as a physical limit, but as a symbol of mystery, the reminder that no matter how far humanity travels, there will always be edges beyond which lies the unknown. Chapter 17. Animals of a Unified World. Animals are the companions of our journey, the other lives that share the earth with us. Their paths cross ours in countless ways, some as prey, some as predators, some as partners in the long experiment of domestication. In our world, the separation of continents gave rise to extraordinary variety. Kangaroos bounded in Australia, llamas walked the Andes, lions roamed Africa, and bison thundered across the plains of North America. Each continent carried its own cast of characters, shaped by isolation, their lives unfolding in parallel but apart. Yet in a world where Pangea never broke apart, the animal kingdom would have been unified, its diversity arranged not in pockets of isolation, but in sweeping ranges across the supercontinent. Imagine herds of grazers moving across the vast temperate belts of Pangea. Instead of wildebeest confined to Africa, bison to North America, and horses to Eurasia, there might have been one continuous tapestry of hoofed creatures roaming in astonishing numbers. The grasslands of Pangea would have thundered with life, millions of animals migrating in waves that spanned horizons, their trails worn deep into the soil by centuries of movement. Predators would have followed, fewer in number than in our fragmented world, but spread over greater ranges. Perhaps there would have been only a handful of dominant predator species, each ruling enormous territories, their shadows familiar to people across thousands of miles. A lion or wolf might not have been confined to one region but known across the supercontinent, a universal symbol of power and fear. The absence of isolation would have changed the very shape of evolution. In our history, marsupials flourished in Australia precisely because they were spared competition with placental mammals. In Madagascar, lemurs thrived in isolation, filling niches that elsewhere were occupied by monkeys and apes. On Pangea, such separations would never have occurred. The most competitive species would have spread across the land, leaving fewer spaces for unique experiments. There might have been less variety overall, but what remained would have been larger in scale. Life would have been less about local strangeness, and more about vast dramas played out over enormous ranges. Where today we marvel at the uniqueness of a platypus or a giant sloth, on Pangea, we might have marvelled instead at the sheer scale of migrations, the continuity of species across the land. Consider the forests. In our world, each major rainforest carries its own distinctive life. Jaguars and tapirs in the Amazon, gorillas in the Congo, orangutans in Borneo. On Pangea, one unbroken equatorial forest belt might have hosted a more uniform set of species, spread across thousands of miles. The same monkey could have swung from trees in regions now separated by oceans. The same bird might have sung its call in distant valleys that never touched in our timeline. Diversity within the forest would still exist, but the boundaries between regions would be softer, the transitions less abrupt. Instead of distinct Amazon or Congo ecosystems, there would have been one great green realm, filled with creatures that belonged everywhere at once. The deserts of Pangea would have told another story. Vast and arid, they would have tested life with extremes. In our world, deserts host unique creatures: camels in the Middle East, kangaroo rats in North America, thorny devils in Australia. On Pangea, deserts might have been larger but less unique, their creatures spread across entire belts rather than confined to corners of the world. Camels, or something like them, might have become universal, their resilience making them the dominant life of the dry zones. Lizards, snakes and scorpions would have flourished too, stretching their ranges across thousands of miles. For the people living near these deserts, the animals would have been constant presences, familiar to all, shaping myths and survival alike. Birds would have painted the skies of Pangea in continuous movement. Migration, already a marvel in our world, would have reached astonishing scales on a supercontinent. Flocks might have flown from pole to pole without ever leaving land, tracing routes thousands of miles long, their journeys shared by countless human cultures. The call of a familiar bird might have echoed across the entire supercontinent, a sound known to every community. In our history, birds often carry symbolic meaning: eagles, ravens, doves. But on Pangea, those meanings might have been more universal, the same species inspiring awe or reverence across all of humanity. For early humans, the unification of the animal world would have shaped both survival and imagination. Hunting strategies would have been shared more widely, because the prey itself would have been more universal. A technique that worked in one region might have worked in many, spreading along trade routes and migration paths. Domestication, too, would have been accelerated by this continuity. Once horses, cattle, or goats were tamed, they would have been accessible to people across the supercontinent, not limited to a single region. The uneven distribution of animals that shaped history in our world, the lack of domesticable animals in the Americas, the isolation of marsupials in Australia would not have existed. On Pangea, humanity might have shared in the same animals from the very beginning, giving civilizations a more equal footing in the long arc of progress. But there is another side to this vision. The lack of isolation would also have made life more fragile. A disease among animals could have swept across the entire supercontinent, devastating herds from one end of Pangea to the other. A predator driven to extinction in one region might have vanished everywhere, its absence reshaping ecosystems across thousands of miles. Diversity protects life, and in Pangea, with fewer unique branches, that protection might have been weaker. Humanity would have shared in abundance, but also in risk, tied more tightly to the fate of animals spread across the whole land. Culturally, the universality of animals would have left its mark. Myths often grow from encounters with creatures, and on Pangea, those encounters would have been shared. The same predator haunting forests in the east would have haunted them in the west. The same herd thundering across grasslands in one region would have been mirrored in another far away. Stories about these creatures might have been nearly universal, told in different languages but with the same characters. Where our world has different sacred animals in different places, Pangea might have had a shared bestiary, a common mythic language of wolves, lions, eagles, and serpents. Humanity's imagination would have been less fragmented, its symbols more united. In the modern age, the animal world of Pangea would astonish us in its continuity. Instead of fragmented biodiversity hotspots, there would be immense ranges of familiar creatures. Safaris would not be confined to Africa, but possible across vast belts of grassland. Forests in distant regions would host the same species, recognizable across the world. The uniqueness of animals might be less, but the scale of their presence would be overwhelming. To walk across Pangea would be to walk through the same animal stories repeated in endless variations, a reminder of connection rather than separation. And as we rest with this vision, it is worth remembering how deeply animals shape us not just in our survival, but in our sense of wonder. On Pangea, the animal kingdom would have been both less diverse and more universal. Its characters fewer but more familiar. Humanity would have shared not only the land, but the creatures that walked it, their paths woven into ours across the same endless stage. The animals of a unified world would not have been strange surprises found on distant continents, but constant companions known to all, shaping the shared imagination of one vast unbroken earth. Chapter 18. The Great Migrations. Movement has always been part of life's rhythm. From the smallest insect drifting on the wind to the great herds that thunder across the plains, migration is one of nature's most profound expressions of continuity. On our Earth, these journeys are shaped and constrained by the geography of continents. Birds follow flyways that cross seas. Wildebeest migrate across Africa, while caribou travel across the Arctic tundra. Yet every migration is bounded by oceans, by mountains, by divisions of land. But on Pangea, with all the world's land joined into one supercontinent, migration would have been something else entirely. It would not have been local or regional, but global. Journeys would have stretched farther, herds larger, flocks vaster, the movement of life itself woven into a single fabric across the earth. Imagine first the herds of grazers. Today we marvel at the migrations of wildebeest in Africa, hundreds of thousands moving in synchronized rhythm following the rains. On Pangea, without oceans to halt them, migrations might have stretched for thousands of miles. Herds might have started in one temperate region, and slowly, season by season, followed the grass across belts of land, reaching climates on the far side of the supercontinent. The sound of their hooves would have been like thunder rolling across the earth, their trails so deeply worn that they became permanent features of the land. These paths would have been visible from the air as living rivers, flowing with movement, marking the pulse of the world itself. Predators would have followed. Wolves, lions, or their Pangean equivalents might have travelled with the herds, their own migrations tied to the abundance of prey. Unlike in our world, where predators often remain within specific ranges, on Pangea, their territories might have been continental. The same predator species could have been encountered by people thousands of miles apart, known everywhere as a universal presence. Their stories, their symbolism, their shadow in human imagination would have been shared by all. Humanity's relationship with predators might have been both more fearful and more unified, for everyone would have known the same hunters. Bird migrations would have been even more astonishing. Today, we already know of birds that fly from pole to pole, navigating oceans and continents with unerring precision. On Pangea, such migrations would have been far easier. Birds might have followed climate belts without ever crossing open seas, tracing continuous routes across the land. Flocks so large they darkened the skies might have been a common sight, waves of wings rolling over cities and forests alike. The calls of these birds would have been familiar to all, their migrations marking the seasons not just in one region but across the entire supercontinent. People everywhere might have looked to the skies at the same time, watching the same species pass overhead, tying human calendars to the rhythm of wings. Even the smallest migrations would have carried new significance. Insects drifting with seasonal winds might have spread across Pangea in vast swarms, their numbers turning skies red or black, their presence felt everywhere at once. Frogs and amphibians following rains might have echoed across thousands of miles, their voices creating a chorus shared across distant lands. The scale of migration would have amplified everything, turning local patterns into continental events, binding the natural world into one vast moving system. For humans, these migrations would have shaped survival and imagination alike. Hunters might have followed herds for months or years, travelling along the same ancient paths, learning to read the land through the movements of animals. Early communities might have settled along these routes, timing their harvests or hunts with the passing of herds and flocks. Myths might have told of animals that circled the entire world, spirits of movement that stitched together the land. Festivals might have been held to mark the arrival of migrating birds or the passage of herds, celebrated not only in one village but across thousands of miles by people who all witnessed the same event. Domestication too would have been tied to migration. Humans might have learned to tame animals not just by capturing them, but by travelling with them, blending their own movements into those of herds. Horses, cattle, or other domesticated animals might have been companions of migration before they became beasts of burden. Humanity itself might have been more migratory, less tied to fixed settlements, its rhythms shaped by the endless cycles of movement around it. Even when cities eventually rose, the memory of migration would have lingered, shaping trade routes, calendars, and beliefs. There is also the question of how migration would have influenced resilience. In our world, ecosystems are often vulnerable to collapse when migrations are interrupted, when birds lose resting places, or herds are blocked by fences. On Pangea, the scale of migration would have made ecosystems both more stable and more fragile. Stable, because the continuity of land allowed animals to move freely, balancing populations and spreading resources. Fragile, because disruptions, disease, drought, or human expansion might have cascaded across the entire system. A blight in the grasses of one region might have starved herds across thousands of miles. A disease among birds might have spread continent-wide in a single season. The interconnectedness of migration would have bound life together, for better and worse. Culturally, the Great Migrations would have been symbols of continuity. Myths might have described the herds as veins of the earth, carrying life's blood across the land. Birds might have been seen as messengers between regions, their passage uniting distant peoples under the same sky. Even the smallest creatures might have carried symbolic weight, their swarms or seasonal arrivals tied to omens, stories, and songs. Humanity's imagination would have been filled not only with the animals themselves, but with the act of movement, the endless, unbroken flow of life across the world. In the modern age, these migrations would have been among the greatest wonders of Pangea. Imagine standing in a city built along an ancient animal path, watching herds that stretch for days, their numbers beyond counting. Imagine skies filled with birds that take hours to pass overhead, their wings casting shifting shadows on the land. Imagine deserts alive with insects, forests echoing with amphibian songs, rivers shimmering with migrating fish. Science would have studied these patterns with awe, mapping the global circulation of life as carefully as we map the circulation of the atmosphere. Conservation would have been not just local but continental, for to protect one migration would mean protecting the web of life across all of Pangea. And as we rest with this vision, it becomes clear that migration is more than movement. It is connection, rhythm, the pulse of life itself. On Pangea, that pulse would have been louder, stronger, more unified, echoing across the entire world. To live on that supercontinent would have been to live in constant awareness of movement of herds that pass like rivers, of birds that flow like tides, of life itself forever on the move. The great migrations of Pangea would not have been local spectacles, but the shared heartbeat of the earth, felt by all, binding humanity and animals alike into one continuous journey across the endless land. Chapter 19. A world without continents. To us, continents are almost inseparable from how we think about the world. They define identity, history, and belonging. We speak of being Asian, African, European, American. Continents give us categories, shaping how we imagine geography and culture alike. They divide the world into neat sections, each with its own story. But in a world where Pangea never broke apart, there would have been no continents. There would have been only one, stretching from horizon to horizon, unbroken. The very idea of continents, the idea of dividing the earth into separate lands, might never have existed. Humanity's relationship with the planet, and with itself, would have been shaped by this singular truth. We all live on one land, under one sky. Imagine how maps would have looked in such a world. Instead of familiar outlines of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, there would have been a single mass of land, surrounded by an endless ocean. The only divisions would have been rivers, mountains, deserts, and forests. A child growing up on Pangea would have learned geography as a series of belts and regions. The forest belt, the desert belt, the grassland belt. They would not think of themselves as from a continent, but from a zone of climate or a river system. Identity would not be continental but ecological. The world itself would feel smaller in one sense, no distant continents to dream of, but larger in another, for the land would never truly end. The absence of continents would have reshaped human imagination. In our world, the discovery of new continents was one of history's great turning points. The meeting of Old World and New World transformed diets, economies, and cultures forever. On Pangea, such discoveries would never have happened. There would be no New World waiting across the ocean, no lands untouched by the rest of humanity. The whole Earth would have been known, at least in outline, far earlier. Exploration would have been less about discovering new continents and more about mapping the interior, uncovering the details of climates, rivers, and mountains. The unknown would not lie beyond the horizon of the sea, but within the folds of the land itself. This would have changed the meaning of exploration. On our Earth, the age of sail carried people to new continents, to lands they had never imagined. On Pangea, there would have been no such leap. Exploration would have meant long journeys across deserts, climbs over mountain ranges, treks through forests that seemed endless. Discovery would not have been sudden but gradual, each step revealing more of the same continuous land. The romance of the sea voyage, of leaving one continent to find another, would not have existed. Instead, humanity's stories of exploration would have been about persistence, endurance, and the slow unveiling of a land that seemed infinite. The lack of continents would also have influenced politics. In our world, continents often defined spheres of power. Europe, Asia, Africa. Each was a stage for empires, their borders shaped by geography and ocean barriers. On Pangea, empires would have risen and fallen within one continuous land, their boundaries drawn by rivers and deserts rather than seas. The idea of global conquest might have been more imaginable, for the world was not divided into separate lands but united into one. At the same time, the sheer scale of Pangea would have made control difficult. No single empire could easily govern the entire supercontinent. Instead, power would likely have clustered into belts or regions, each tied to its climate and resources. The dream of world unity might have been both closer and farther away, closer in imagination, farther in practice. Culturally, the absence of continents would have changed how humanity thought of difference. On our Earth, continents exaggerate separations. They make it easy to imagine us and them, divided by oceans, shaped by distance. On Pangea, differences would still exist, languages, traditions, beliefs, but they would be more continuous, less abrupt. A traveller could move gradually from one culture to another, hearing words shift slowly, foods change subtly, stories blend and transform. Difference would have been a gradient rather than a wall. The idea of completely foreign lands might have been less vivid, for no people would have been cut off by seas for millennia. Strangeness would still exist, but it would always carry echoes of familiarity. This would have influenced religion and philosophy as well. Many of our beliefs are tied to the discovery of distant lands and peoples. The meeting of cultures sparked questions of universality. Is there one truth or many? On Pangea, such questions might have arisen differently. With fewer sharp divisions, there might have been more blending of ideas, more continuity of myth. Gods and spirits might have been shared across vast regions, not because they were spread by conquest, but because land itself carried them. A deity worshipped by farmers in one valley might also be known, in slightly altered form, thousands of miles away. Humanity's spiritual imagination might have been less about division and more about variation. One story told in countless voices across the same land. The absence of continents would also have changed our sense of wonder about the Earth. On our world, continents invite comparison. We marvel at how different Africa feels from Europe, how distant South America is from Asia. On Pangea, the land would not invite such contrasts. Instead, wonder would have arisen from scale. People would have been awed by the sheer size of deserts, by forests that stretched for months of travel, by rivers that wound through landscapes without end. The Earth's beauty would not have been in its separateness, but in its immensity. The world without continents would have felt like one vast canvas, painted in different colours but never broken. In the modern age, this difference would be profound. Today, we think of ourselves as global citizens, crossing continents by plane, uniting lands once divided. On Pangea, that sense of global unity might have been older, for humanity never knew continents at all. There would have been only one world, one land, and the idea of separation by ocean would never have shaped identity. Perhaps nationalism would have developed differently, tied more to regions than to continents. Perhaps the very language of identity, words like Western or Eastern, would not exist, for there would be no East or West, only the endless continuity of land. And yet, even in such a world, the ocean would still have surrounded everything. The edge of Pangea would still meet the waves, reminding people that land, no matter how vast, is still finite. The absence of continents would not mean the absence of mystery. Instead, mystery would have been focused inward, on the endless landscapes of Pangea itself, and outward, on the great sea that circled it all. Humanity would have learned to live without continents, shaping identity through belts and regions, finding connection in continuity rather than division. So picture it now, a world without Africa, without Asia, without the Americas. A world where maps show only one vast land, edged by one vast sea. A child learning geography would never hear the word continent. They would learn, instead of rivers, deserts, forests and mountains, threads of a single fabric, woven together without interruption. In such a world, humanity's story would not be one of continents meeting and colliding, but of one land, one home, one unbroken earth beneath one sky. Chapter 20. The Dream of Unity. When we think of Pangea, the mind drifts toward its physical immensity, the way it stitched the Earth's land into one body, the way deserts, forests, and rivers stretched without end. But beneath this geological wonder lies a question deeper still. What would unity have meant in such a world? Without continents to divide us, without oceans carving us apart, humanity might have carried the possibility of unity differently, not as an abstract dream, but as a tangible truth written into the land itself. To live on Pangea would have been to live in constant awareness that all people, all animals, all cultures were part of one continuous earth. The dream of unity might not have been distant, but ever present, whispering in the shape of the ground beneath our feet. Imagine a child growing up in a village on Pangea. They walk to the edge of the river, watch traders pass with goods from faraway lands, and know that those lands are not across oceans but part of the same earth. They are not unreachable, only far. The child learns that their language shares echoes with others spoken many valleys away. They hear stories that travellers carry from deserts, forests, or grasslands, and those stories feel familiar, carrying the same rhythms, the same truths. Even before maps or compasses, the child senses unity, not because they are taught it, but because the land itself suggests it. This awareness might have shaped how humanity saw itself. On our Earth, unity is often imagined as something to be achieved, something we must strive for against the weight of division. On Pangea, unity might have been a more natural thought. People would still have had differences, languages, religions, customs, but those differences would have seemed more like variations on a shared theme than absolute divides. The idea of a single humanity might have been easier to grasp, rooted not in philosophy but in geography, in the simple fact of one land beneath one sky. Yet unity is not the same as harmony. Even on Pangea there would have been conflicts, wars and rivalries. Empires would still have risen and fallen, drawing boundaries with rivers, deserts or mountains. People would still have seen themselves as us and others as them. But perhaps those divisions would have felt less final, less unbridgeable. On our Earth, oceans made it easy to imagine strangers as truly separate, as inhabiting other worlds. On Pangea, everyone lived on the same land. Enemies might have been feared, but they were never entirely alien. The dream of unity might have lingered even in times of conflict, never fully lost. Consider religion and philosophy. On our Earth, many faiths arose in isolation, shaped by the uniqueness of continents. On Pangea, those ideas might have spread more easily, blending into shared traditions. A belief born in one valley might have been carried by traders and travellers to cities thousands of miles away. Over generations, these ideas might have woven together, creating spiritual systems that felt more universal, less confined to regions. Humanity's sense of the sacred might have reflected the unity of the land. One earth, one home, one fabric of existence. The dream of unity might have been reinforced by the very gods and myths people believed in. Politics, too, would have reflected this geography. On our Earth, global unity is often imagined as something extraordinary, the result of ships, trade, and modern technology bridging oceans. On Pangea, the dream might have been older. Empires would still have struggled to rule vast territories, but the very possibility of ruling the whole world would have felt more conceivable. The world was not split into continents. It was one land, even if no single ruler could truly hold it all. The idea of a global order might have been imagined centuries earlier, a dream shared by philosophers and rulers alike, born not from ambition alone, but from the geography of Pangea itself. Even daily life would have carried hints of unity. A farmer in one region might have planted crops first, cultivated thousands of miles away, their survival linked to the labour of strangers they would never meet. A traveller might have eaten foods familiar across the supercontinent, their flavours uniting people through shared sustenance. A song might have carried echoes of others sung in distant regions, its rhythm shaped by a migration of stories that flowed across the land. In countless small ways, humanity would have felt connected, not only by trade or war, but by the shared patterns of culture, survival, and imagination. But unity carries risks too. Just as shared crops and animals make abundance possible, they also make humanity more vulnerable to collapse. A disease among people could sweep across Pangea without oceans to slow it. A famine might spread farther, affecting many more lives. The dream of unity might have been shadowed by the dangers of interconnectedness. People would have learned early that unity is double-edged. It binds us together in strength, but also in fragility. Perhaps this awareness would have deepened compassion, reminding societies that helping neighbours was also a way of helping themselves. Or perhaps it would have fueled fear, encouraging wars and divisions even within one land. Still, the dream of unity would never have been far away. It would have been felt in the migrations of animals, in the patterns of climate belts, in the shared presence of predators and prey. It would have been seen in the stories of travellers who walked for months but always remained on the same land. It would have been heard in the echo of words, different yet familiar, spoken by strangers across the supercontinent. Unity would not have been an invention. It would have been a truth woven into daily life, as natural as the horizon. In the modern age, this would have changed humanity's trajectory. Today, we marvel at the idea of global connection, of instant communication across continents, of a world brought together by technology. On Pangea, the sense of one world might have been older, less reliant on modern invention. Perhaps nations would still exist, perhaps rivalries would still flare, but beneath them all would lie the unshakable awareness that we all share one land. The dream of unity might not have been something to invent, but something to remember, something humanity could forget in moments of conflict, but always rediscover in the continuity of the Earth. So let us pause with this image. You stand on Pangea, the supercontinent, the endless land. You know that somewhere far away, beyond deserts and mountains, live people who are strangers but not truly separate. You know that their lives are tied to yours, through trade, through food, through stories, through the simple truth of one land beneath one sky. You realize then that unity is not a dream but a reality, always present, waiting to be recognized. On Pangea, the dream of unity would not have been distant. It would have been the quiet foundation of existence, the reminder that no matter how vast the land, it is still one Earth, and we are still one people.